Hey guys, tonight we're stepping quietly into a world of velvet veils, perfumed ink, and empty thrones. A world where young women became symbols before they became people. You're about to drift through the lonely corridors of royal power, where arranged marriages were stitched together by treaties, and brides found themselves shipped like parcels to kingdoms they couldn't even pronounce. It's a soft, glittering nightmare of diamonds and duty, and you probably won't survive this one awake. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And tell me, where are you listening from tonight? Maybe you're in bed, or on a long midnight drive, or just curled up in a corner of the world where the only sound is a fan humming. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You're standing in a vast stone hall, the kind where voices echo long after the people who spoke them are gone. It smells faintly of wax, parchment, and something sweetly rotten like the petals of old roses. Here, marriage isn't about romance, it's about maps. Every union means land changing hands, peace treaties being sealed, or wars being delayed. You're looking at a table where men in furs and gold chains argue in Latin over the fate of a girl who's still learning to read. She's a pawn, a token, a diplomatic olive branch wrapped in lace. Somewhere she's playing with a carved wooden doll, while her father signs a document promising her future to a man she'll never meet. In the 16th century, this was completely normal. Princesses were treated as currency, and sometimes the interest rate was steep. Catherine of Aragon, for instance, was sent to England to marry Prince Arthur at just 15. She barely spoke the language, wore strange clothes, and found herself in a castle so cold she wrote home begging for more blankets. Historians still argue whether her first husband actually died before or after their marriage was consummated, a small but crucial detail that shaped the entire course of English history. And then there's Margaret of Austria, who was engaged at 3 years old. 3. Before most of us can tie our shoes, she was pledged to the Dauphin of France. She was sent to the French court, raised among strangers, and eventually sent back when the engagement was cancelled like a diplomatic boomerang. Royal marriages were drafted like battle plans. Who gets which territory? How many cannons as dowry? What titles will the children inherit? And perhaps most important of all, who gets to control the bride's womb? Because that's what these deals really boil down to: inheritance and bloodlines. Love? Not on the guest list. You can almost hear the scratch of quills and the rustle of paper as kings and ambassadors seal their daughters' fates. They exchange promises, portraits, and coded letters filled with flattery. Some of these negotiations lasted for years, long enough that the happy couple could age out of marriage entirely before even meeting. But here's the part they didn't tell you in your history textbook. Sometimes the brides resisted, quietly, subtly. There's a story, possibly apocryphal, though I like to believe it, about a young Spanish princess who, upon hearing she was to be married to an old widower king, told her maid she'd rather take the veil than the vows. She fell ill just days before her departure. The illness, suspiciously, cleared up once the engagement was broken. Even so, most had no choice. A princess could cry, but she couldn't say no. You can picture her, can't you? Sitting in front of a mirror as maids pin jewels into her hair, her eyes red from a night of silent weeping. Her nurse whispers something comforting, but the girl knows it's too late. The ship is waiting. The sea doesn't care about tears. One quirky fact: many royal brides had to practice walking, bowing, and even eating before their departure, because every gesture was political theatre. A single misstep could offend a future mother-in-law or a neighbouring duke. Some were taught to smile without showing their teeth, since smiling too broadly was considered vulgar in certain courts. You imagine trying to sleep the night before you're sent away. The candle flickers, shadows crawl across the canopy, and you're not sure which is worse, the fear of leaving or the fear of staying. Outside your window, musicians play something soft and formal, the soundtrack of a life that isn't yours anymore. Royal chroniclers love to romanticize these departures, writing about brides sailing toward destiny. But what they really meant was teenagers sent to live with strangers for the sake of politics. Many never saw their parents again. Some didn't even make it to their new homes. Ships sank, bandits struck, rebellions erupted mid-journey. History, as always, doesn't weep for the lost. The irony is that the men arranging these marriages often didn't trust the brides once they arrived. They were treated like spies in silk, potential threats wrapped in brocade. They couldn't write letters home without them being censored. Some weren't even allowed to attend church alone. Imagine being considered too politically dangerous to pray in private. And yet, from this gilded misery emerged unexpected strength. These brides learned diplomacy in ways their tutors never intended. They smiled at enemies, traded gossip like weapons, and sometimes turned entire courts in their favor just by surviving long enough to outlive the men who sold them. You glance around that stone hall again. The candles burn lower, the ink dries. Somewhere your scribe rolls up another parchment, sealing it with wax and a sigh. Another marriage arranged, another girl's name erased beneath her future husband's title. You feel the weight of it, the loneliness woven into history's prettiest fabrics. You wonder how many royal portraits you've seen, all those serene faces in frames, and never realized that behind those eyes was someone who never got to choose who she loved. And yet in their silence, they shape dynasties. Every tear, every forced smile, every night they stood alone at a foreign window, all of it became part of the great machinery of power. History, it turns out, was often built on the grief of women who weren't even allowed to tell their own stories. The hall grows darker. The musicians fade. The ink cools. And somewhere in that flickering quiet, the first letter of a royal engagement is signed, sealing not just a treaty, but a lifetime of hidden sorrow. You wake up the next morning to the soft clatter of hooves outside and the smell of burning incense. The princess is leaving today. You follow the commotion down the marble steps. Servants are rushing, horses are stamping, and the dowager queen is pretending not to cry behind a lace fan. The air tastes like perfume and politics. They call it the price of a crown, but no one says it out loud. Everyone knows what's really happening. A young girl's freedom is being traded for a signature on a treaty. And the worst part? Everyone acts like it's an honor. You watch her step into a carriage so heavy with gold leaf it could pay for a village. She's 16, maybe 17 if she's lucky, and she's been promised to a man she's never met. Someone twice her age, someone who might already have bastards older than she is. But the court whispers that it's a good match. You might think this only happened in one era, but no. This was a tradition that stretched across centuries and continents. Medieval Europe, Mughal India, Tokugawa Japan, royal families everywhere turned their daughters into human peace treaties. A daughter was a bond, a womb was a weapon. Take Isabella of Valois, for example. She was just 6 years old when she was betrothed to England's King Richard II, who was 29. 6. The poor girl was sent off like a diplomatic gift, barely tall enough to hold the ceremonial bouquet they handed her. Historians still argue whether her marriage was ever consummated, but honestly, that's not the debate that matters. What mattered was how adults, kings, popes, and courtiers could smile while turning a child into a political strategy. Even centuries later, the same logic held. In the 18th century, Maria Josepha of Saxony cried so hard before her arranged marriage to the future King Louis XV that her attendants had to hide her red eyes with powder and cold spoons. A princess must not look puffy, they said, as if grief could ruin diplomacy. And of course, no one dared to refuse. The one who tried, poor Christina of Denmark, famously said she'd rather lose her head than marry Henry VIII. Clever girl. Since a few years later, that's exactly what happened to several of his wives. You picture the wedding contracts laid out like battle maps, dowries listed in florins, jewels and fortresses. In exchange for this marriage, one document reads, "The King of France shall provide safe passage for Spanish goods through the Pyrenees." Somewhere between the rubies and the border rights, a little girl's name sits in ink, just another clause between kingdoms. Sometimes the betrothal happened before the bride could even walk. In 1479, the future Queen Anne of Brittany was engaged before her second birthday. By age 12, she was married by proxy to a man she'd never see in a chapel she'd never visited. You think about what that means. Being raised, knowing your whole life is already planned out, your destiny tied to a stranger's name. Every meal, every dress, every prayer is preparation for a role you didn't audition for. The portraits come next, always the portraits. Artists were instructed to flatter the features of royal children. Soften noses, widen eyes, add a touch of divine serenity. When these images were sent abroad, they weren't portraits at all. They were advertisements, brochures for dynastic deals. One artist, Hans Holbein the Younger, was basically the 16th century equivalent of a dating app filter. He painted Anne of Cleves for Henry VIII, making her look serene and lovely. When Henry met her in person, he famously grumbled that she looked like a Flanders mare. Historians still argue whether Henry was simply disappointed or using the insult as an excuse to get out of the match. Either way, poor Anne was humiliated and divorced within months. And yet, she might have been one of the luckiest. Her short, unconsummated marriage ended with her still alive and wealthy, known affectionately as the king's sister. In royal circles, that's practically a fairy tale ending. Most weren't so lucky. Many brides were sent away never to return, vanishing into foreign courts that viewed them with suspicion. Their purpose was simple: secure peace and bear heirs. If peace faltered or the womb stayed empty, the blame was immediate. "The princess is cursed," they'd whisper. "Her blood is impure." It was never the groom's fault, of course. One strange custom. In some medieval courts, the bride's wedding night was publicly witnessed, not in the horrifying way you might imagine, but symbolically. Courtiers would escort the couple to bed, pour wine, draw the curtains, and then wait outside until the candles were blown out. When the light vanished, they would cheer. Imagine your private life beginning with a standing ovation. And if the marriage failed, the girl was sent back, sometimes with no dowry returned, sometimes branded as defective merchandise. Yes, that was an actual term in a 15th century diplomatic letter. It's easy to forget that most of these brides were barely women. Their dolls and tutors were replaced overnight by courtiers and crowns. Their lives became a series of performances, every smile a policy, every sigh a headline. But even within that glittering trap, some learned to wield quiet power. They became translators, mediators, and secret diplomats. Their letters could mend wars or ignite them. When men ignored them, they learned to whisper to those who mattered, chamberlains, confessors, mistresses, and you realize as the carriage rolls out through the palace gates that this is how history really moved not by kings with swords, but by brides with no choice at all. The wheels crunch over gravel, the palace shrinks behind her, the banners flutter like ghosts, and the girl, or the one they call lucky, looks back only once. Because looking twice would mean admitting she's never coming home. You hear the creak of a wooden easel and the shuffle of silk shoes on marble floors. This is where the next stage of the story begins. In a painter's studio, filled with candlelight, pigment dust, and expectations. Before the bride ever meets her husband, she meets the artist who will decide how she'll be remembered. You stand in the corner, watching as the princess sits perfectly still. She's not allowed to fidget, even though the jeweled collar biting her neck weighs as much as her crown will one day. The painter tilts his head, squinting. His brush hovers. The court minister stands nearby, making gentle suggestions. Make her eyes a touch bluer. The king favours blue. Perhaps a little less shadow under the nose. He doesn't like melancholy. The girl exhales through her nose. She's been told to look virtuous but fertile. No one explains what that means. Portraits of royal brides were propaganda disguised as art. The original Photoshop, centuries before retouching was invented. Entire alliances hinged on a well-painted cheekbone. In the 15th and 16th centuries, painters were given strict orders to beautify, idealize, and flatter. Reality was bad diplomacy. You can almost smell the linseed oil and turpentine, hear the quiet scratch of brush on canvas. The princess is exhausted. The sitting has lasted 6 hours. Her hand trembles slightly, and the painter snaps at her to hold still. She bites her lip to stop it from quivering. This image, she knows, will be sent to the man she's supposed to call husband. It's her only chance to make him like her, or at least not reject her. Anne of Cleves, remember her? Her portrait was painted by Hans Holbein the Younger. It was meant to secure her match with Henry VIII. Holbein captured her with soft lighting, delicate features, and a placid expression. The royal version of a calm dating profile. But when Henry saw her in person, he claimed she looked nothing like the painting. Some say he shouted, "I like her not!" The truth is probably less dramatic, but the insult stuck like wax on parchment. Historians still argue whether Holbein was simply too flattering, or whether Henry had unrealistic expectations, which given his ego seems likely. Either way, one brushstroke changed history. Anne's marriage to the king ended almost immediately, but her calm composure saved her life. She became his beloved sister, living quietly in comfort, one of the few royal brides who found peace through rejection. But most weren't that lucky. Many brides discovered the gap between portrait and person in far crueler ways. Imagine being shown your future husband's painting. Maybe he's young, charming, wearing a satin doublet and holding a book to look intellectual. You cling to the fantasy that he's kind. Then, after weeks of travel, seasickness, and fear, you finally meet him. And he's 30 years older, smells like wine and horses, and greets you with a curt nod. You smile anyway because kingdoms are watching. In the 17th century, Christina of Sweden reportedly said she'd never marry because men are so inferior. A bold statement, yes, but also a reflection of what she saw happen to every woman around her. Their portraits were love letters, their marriages were contracts. And then there's Mary Tudor. Bloody Mary to her critics, though history might owe her an apology. When she married Philip II of Spain, she was so desperate for affection that she ordered new gowns, new jewels, and even learned Spanish customs to please him. But Philip, stiff and cold, treated her like a ceremonial obligation. Their official portraits showed a perfect royal couple. Behind the frame, she wept nightly. One quirky historical tidbit, Some kings refused to meet their brides until the portrait was approved by committee. Philip IV of Spain, for instance, demanded a dozen miniature portraits of his future wife, each painted under supervision, just to ensure no trickery of light or brush. You almost want to hand him a smartphone and say, "Buddy, you'd hate filters." And yet, portraits weren't only deception, they were confession too. Artists sometimes slipped secret details into their work, hints of the bride's true emotion. A slightly downturned mouth, a shadow in the eyes, hands clasped too tightly, subtle rebellions captured in oil and pigment. Some modern art historians argue these imperfections were deliberate, the painter's quiet sympathy for the girl trapped before him. You wonder how many times a bride's real feelings were hidden behind varnish. How many heartbreaks have we admired in museums without realizing they were heartbreaks at all? The portraits traveled with escorts, packed in velvet-lined crates, carried by couriers who might not even know whose face they bore. Sometimes they arrived damaged, a smudge, a crack, a blot of moisture, and entire negotiations collapsed over it. A damaged portrait was an omen. One tragicomic case, in 1514, the Duke of Lorraine sent a portrait of his daughter to France, only for it to arrive with the face blurred by humidity. The French court claimed it was a sign of divine disfavor. The alliance was cancelled. The poor girl was never married. She became a nun instead, living her days surrounded by portraits of saints who looked just as lonely as she did. And yet these images outlived everyone involved. The girls aged, died, were buried, the husbands remarried, but the portrait stayed young forever. You glance around that candlelit studio again. The painter dips his brush, capturing the sheen of silk, the soft light on a pearl earring. He doesn't know, or maybe he does, that his work will decide the course of a nation. The princess breathes in, the brush moves, and somewhere, hundreds of miles away, a future husband is staring at another portrait, thinking the same thing. She looks perfect. Neither of them realizes they're falling in love with a ghost. The paint dries, the portrait gleams, the lie becomes history. The sea smells of salt and something metallic, like the edge of a sword left out in the rain. You're standing on the deck of a ship that rocks just enough to unsettle your stomach. The bride sits nearby, pale as the mist, her veil fluttering in the wind like a white flag of surrender. The gulls circle above, their cries slicing through the air, sharper than any farewell. This is the journey to nowhere, and the voyage every royal bride must take after her portrait has done its job. The contracts are signed, the gifts exchanged, the prayers mumbled. Now comes the part where she physically leaves one life and sails into another, usually never to return. It's not glamorous, not really. The paintings made it look like adventure, a glowing princess waving from the prow, hair perfect, attendants smiling. But in truth these ships reeked of fear, vomit and seaweed. The brides were seasick, terrified, and often ill-prepared for the brutal journey ahead. You look at her again. She's trying not to cry, but her eyes keep darting back toward the receding shoreline. That's home disappearing into fog. She'll never see it again. Catherine of Aragon's crossing from Spain to England in 1501 was so stormy that the entire fleet nearly sank. Her attendants vomited, her chests of jewels were soaked through, and at one point the sailors whispered prayers thinking they'd all die. But when the winds finally calmed and she stepped onto English soil, they still expected her to smile and curtsy as if she'd just returned from a pleasant stroll. Historians still argue whether she ever forgave that sea or the men who sent her across it. Another famous traveller, Princess Caroline of Brunswick, sent from Germany to marry the future King George IV of England in 1795. Her ship journey was a misery of damp mattresses and seasick courtiers. When she finally arrived, She fainted from exhaustion before she could even meet her husband. George reportedly took one look at her, turned pale, and muttered, "I'm not well." Romantic beginnings indeed. For these brides, the voyage wasn't just a change of scenery, it was a transformation ritual, like a cocoon, except when it opened, there was no butterfly. You can almost hear the clinking of the trunks below deck, filled with gowns, jewels, and diplomatic gifts, each item catalogued, each gem insured, each comb and mirror listed in triplicate. The bride herself, she's just another line item. Sometimes the ships carried entire miniature households, cooks, seamstresses, chaplains, even court jesters, because heaven forbid a princess laugh in the wrong language. Everything familiar was brought along only to be stripped away upon arrival. It was customary that when a royal bride entered her new country, all her attendants were dismissed and replaced with local ones to ensure loyalty to the new court. Imagine stepping off the boat, still shaking from the voyage, and being told that everyone who speaks your language has to leave immediately. One quirky tidbit, Marie Antoinette underwent something called a ceremonial stripping at the border between Austria and France. She had to stand in a tent, remove every article of Austrian clothing, and be dressed anew in French garments. Even her jewellery was replaced. "You belong to France now," they told her. She was 14. You can feel that kind of humiliation even now. Centuries later, the ceremony was meant to symbolize rebirth, but it felt more like an erasure. One historian called it a baptism into exile. And then there were the dangers. The sea wasn't the only threat. Pirates, storms, disease, all common companions on these bridal voyages. In 1396, Isabella of France was sent to marry Richard II. Her flotilla was attacked by pirates in the Channel, and several of her attendants were killed. The young princess watched from below deck as cannon smoke filled the horizon. By the time she reached England, she was already older, not by years, but by sorrow. You wonder what the nights were like on those ships. The sound of waves slapping the hull, the creak of ropes, the cold creeping through the wood. You imagine her lying awake, clutching the edge of the bed, wondering what her husband looks like, if he'll be kind, if he'll even recognize her name. Sometimes the ship never arrived at all. In 1622, the Spanish galleon Nuestra Señora del Rosario sank en route to Naples, carrying the dowry and attendants of a young bride-to-be. Only fragments of lace and splintered chests were ever found. The groom remarried within a year. Historians still argue whether the lost bride's name was even recorded correctly. A life reduced to a footnote, drowned in a storm. It wasn't always tragedy, though. A few brides found wonder at sea, brief, fleeting glimpses of freedom before captivity resumed. Letters from the Habsburg Archduchess, Maria Anna, mention how she'd sneak onto the deck at night, barefoot, to feel the wind on her skin. "I have never felt so alive," she wrote, "or so doomed." The ocean, after all, doesn't care for crowns. Out here, everyone's equal. Even queens-to-be get seasick. You can almost taste the salt on the air, feel the ship sway beneath your feet. The crew murmurs prayers to saints. The bride stares at the horizon, her face half lit by lanterns. Somewhere in her chest, a quiet panic beats like a second heart. Tomorrow, she'll arrive at a strange shore. Strangers will greet her, strangers will dress her, strangers will decide when she eats, when she speaks, when she sleeps. But tonight, just for these few hours, she belongs to no kingdom, no husband, no court. Just the dark sea, whispering secrets beneath her feet. The ship tilts slightly and the lantern swings, casting golden ripples across her gown. She closes her eyes and breathes in the salt. If she could, she might jump. Not to die, but simply to escape the script. Instead, she stays still. She was raised for duty, not defiance. And as the ship cuts through the black water like a blade, she realizes something both terrifying and true. She is no longer a person. She is history in transit. The ship docks before dawn, and you feel the thud of the gangplank strike the pier like a heartbeat. The air on this new shore feels heavier, different somehow, like a language your lungs don't yet speak. The bride steps down slowly, every movement measured, rehearsed, watched. The cheering crowd blurs before her. She can't tell where ceremony ends and surveillance begins. This is the first morning of her new life, the day she'll meet her husband for the first time. The morning of the wedding night that no one dares name. The morning of silence. They told her he was handsome, pious, and gallant. But the portrait in her travel trunk was painted years ago, and paint doesn't age. She rehearses her lines anyway, how to curtsy, when to smile, what to say if he's pleased, what to say if he's not. The guards form a corridor of steel and velvet as she's led toward the palace. It's colder here, the stones still wet with dew. The people who bow to her do so without warmth, their eyes flicking over her foreign jewels. Inside, the palace smells faintly of incense, horses and smoke. Everything she owns is catalogued, inspected, and politely confiscated. The royal steward bows and says, "His Majesty will receive you in the afternoon." That word, receive, echoes like a warning. The afternoon stretches endlessly. Musicians tune lutes that will never be played. Servants bring dishes she doesn't recognize, cold meats, too much vinegar. No one speaks her language except the maid assigned to translate, who keeps glancing nervously toward the door. When the king finally enters, the air shifts. He's not what the painting promised. His hair is thinner, his expression harder. He bows stiffly, as if performing a ritual he'd rather skip. She drops into a curtsy, holding her breath so she doesn't tremble. He says something she can't quite understand. His tone is polite, but the words sound hollow, like a speech memorized long ago. Someone interprets, "His Majesty welcomes you." She tries to smile. Later, during the ceremony, the chapel glows with candlelight. The scent of myrrh and melting wax thick in the air. The vows are in Latin. She repeats each phrase carefully, though she doesn't know what they mean. The crown feels impossibly heavy when they place it on her head. Somewhere in the crowd, she hears a woman stifle a laugh. When the ring slides onto her finger, it's cold as metal from a tomb. You want to look away. The entire room feels like a stage set, the actors too tired to pretend joy. After the feast, endless, glittering, deafening, the courtiers lead them to the bridal chamber. The crowd follows, laughing softly, like they're in on a secret. The air smells of wine and candle smoke. The bed is massive, embroidered with golden threads, an altar disguised as comfort. In some courts, it's tradition to make a show of this moment. The attendants bring in wine, sing a blessing, pull the curtains closed. Then they wait outside until the candles go out. A symbolic extinguishing, a proof of union. In others, witnesses stay longer, listening for sounds no one should have to prove. You can feel her heartbeat, a trapped bird's rhythm. He stands beside her, removing his gloves, his expression unreadable. She curtsies again out of habit, though there's no need. He says nothing. She says nothing. This is the first night of silence. They sit side by side on the edge of the bed, like strangers waiting for a carriage that never comes. Outside, the courtiers whisper, trying to guess what's happening. Inside, two lives hang in the balance between obligation and despair. One mainstream historical fact: when Mary, Queen of Scots, married the Dauphin of France in 1558, she was 16, he was 14. Their wedding night was attended by nearly the entire royal court. The next morning, servants examined the bedclothes and publicly declared the marriage blessed. Imagine being a teenager under that microscope, every breath political. Historians still argue whether such public rituals were meant to reassure courts or humiliate brides. Sometimes, though, the husband didn't even appear. Charles II of France reportedly refused to see his new queen, Isabeau of Bavaria, for days, claiming the stars were not aligned. A convenient excuse for cold feet. You picture that kind of waiting, the candles burning low, the silence stretching longer than the night itself, the sound of footsteps that never come. And when he finally does arrive, it's not romance, it's bureaucracy of the body, the joining of kingdoms, not hearts. The bride learns quickly to lie still and not speak. Words could break alliances, expressions could start wars. A sigh might be misread by servants eager to gossip. And yet in some small part of her, she still hopes. Every young woman does, that he might look at her and see a person, not a pawn. That this strange bed might become something warmer than duty. But when dawn seeps through the curtains, the bed is cold on her side. He's gone already, off to hunt, to meet advisers, to resume being king. She's left staring at the ceiling, wondering if this was all there is. Her maid enters with breakfast. "You are blessed," she says, smiling with forced politeness. The people rejoice. The bride nods and takes a sip of watered wine. It tastes of salt. That's when she notices her reflection in the silver goblet. The girl who left home is gone. The one who looks back wears the same crown but different eyes, eyes that already understand what it means to be alone in a room full of people. Outside, church bells ring. The city celebrates a union it will never witness between two strangers who never truly met. Inside, the bride begins her reign of silence, of smiles without joy, of nights spent staring at an empty pillow. And though history won't record this, you can still feel it, the weight of that invisible grief pressed deep into the sheets of every royal bed that ever became a tomb for love. Morning breaks slowly, as if reluctant to face her. The sunlight seeps through the drapes like a shy servant, filtering through the gauze of the canopy bed. You sit beside her as she wakes, the queen who isn't quite a queen yet. A stranger, wrapped in silk, surrounded by silence that hums louder than any song. Her first instinct is to reach for the small box of letters she keeps beneath her pillow. Notes from home, sealed with red wax, the last fragments of the world that knew her name before it was replaced by a title. But when she opens the lid, it's empty. Letters are gone. A polite explanation arrives soon after. For security reasons, all correspondence to and from Her Majesty will henceforth be reviewed and approved by the Royal Secretary. You can almost hear the paper tear as her heart folds into itself. This is the chapter of the missing voices, the slow, suffocating grief of letters that never arrive, or arrive censored, rewritten, or lost to the winds of diplomacy. For many royal brides, isolation wasn't a side effect of politics, it was the point. The fewer connections they maintained to their homeland, the less chance of divided loyalty. And so couriers vanished, messengers were detained, and ink turned to silence. Catherine of Braganza, the Portuguese Queen of England, experienced it firsthand. Married to Charles II, she arrived in London in 1662, bringing with her a dowry so massive it included the cities of Bombay and Tangier. Yet the one thing she wasn't allowed to bring was her voice. Her letters to her mother were intercepted, edited, and sometimes rewritten by English courtiers before being sent. Historians still argue whether her homesickness was merely personal or politically dangerous. You can almost see her sitting at her writing desk. the quill trembling slightly in her hand, candlelight flickering across her knuckles. She writes anyway, pouring out every ache she can't say aloud. The words aren't even for her husband anymore. They're for the only people who ever spoke to her without titles: her mother, her sister, her confessor. And then the waiting begins. Days stretch into weeks. Every carriage that rattles into the courtyard makes her heart lift, just a little. But when the footman enters, it's always with petitions, not replies. Some brides tried to sneak letters through sympathetic servants. They folded tiny notes into hems of gowns, tucked them under bread loaves, or sewed them into pillow seams. But the palace was always watching. Servants were questioned, maids dismissed. The invisible bars closed tighter. One quirky tidbit: Marie Antoinette used a secret ink made from milk and lemon juice for private messages to her brother, Emperor Joseph II. The words appeared only when warmed by candlelight. She called it her ink of breath. The letters read like sighs on paper. Some survived, faint and fragile, like whispers pressed between glass. But most didn't. You can picture the couriers trembling as they decide which letters to deliver and which to lose. After all, a misplaced message could mean demotion, or worse, and sometimes even the ones that arrived caused disaster. Anne of Austria, Queen of France and mother of Louis XIV, wrote regularly to her Spanish relatives during her early years at court. When one of her letters was intercepted, it was found to contain affectionate phrases that the paranoid French council deemed treasonous. She was accused of conspiring with Spain and nearly exiled, all for a few sentimental words written in the wrong language. Historians still argue whether she meant any harm or simply longed for the only home she ever knew. It's cruel, really, how silence becomes the measure of loyalty. How a woman's longing can be twisted into politics. The Queen walks now through her palace gardens, her eyes tracing the sky for birds. Pigeons are forbidden, potential messengers. Even her confessor must report their conversations to the king's advisers. So she learns to speak carefully, to smile when she's breaking inside. You walk beside her along a path lined with marble statues. Women carved in perfect stillness, draped in stone veils. Their mouths are open, but they make no sound. Sometimes she dreams of her homeland. The way the light hit the water near her childhood window, the sound of church bells at sunset, the smell of bread rising in the kitchen. She wakes up crying but never remembers why. And when her husband finally visits, he speaks of matters of state. Trade routes, wars, alliances. Never loneliness, never love. She nods because nodding is all that's expected of her. Later that night, she sits at her writing desk again. The candle burns low. The room smells faintly of lavender and melted wax. She takes a scrap of parchment. Not an official one, just the back of an old letter she's already sent, and begins writing to no one in particular. "I am well," she writes. "I smile often." Then she stops. The ink blot spreads slowly, a dark stain in the center of the page, like a wound that refuses to close. She dips the quill again, hesitates, and then adds softly beneath it, "But I think I am fading." The next morning, the page is gone. The chambermaids tidy too thoroughly, the papers vanish, and the silence resumes. It's strange how grief leaves no trace when paper burns quietly. And yet somewhere in an archive, deep beneath the dust of centuries, a few of those letters still exist. Historians pore over them with gloves and magnifiers, whispering about melancholy phrasing and possible codes. They debate the meaning of every word. But if you listen closely enough, beneath the layers of translation and analysis, you can still hear what the bride really meant. "I am lonely. Please write back." The sound of the waves outside her window is softer tonight. The couriers have long since gone to bed. Somewhere beyond the walls, life continues. Bells ring, dogs bark, stars tremble above the rooftops. Inside, the Queen dips her pen one last time and writes a name she's not allowed to say aloud anymore. Her homeland's name. Then she blows out the candle. And in the darkness, you realize the cruelest truth of all. Even the letters that never arrive still wait for answers. The mornings grow colder now, and you can smell the shift in the air. That sharp, mineral scent of approaching winter that seeps into even the thickest velvet curtains. The Queen wakes before dawn, not because she wants to, but because the noise in her head never really stops. Every sound in this foreign palace seems to whisper the same message. You do not belong here. The walls themselves are beautiful, frescoes of battles she doesn't understand, saints she doesn't recognize, gods that never prayed for her. The servants move like ghosts, polite but cautious, and every time she enters a room, the chatter dims, replaced by the brittle rustle of silk and suspicion. This is the cold court and the colder eyes, the quiet hostility of a kingdom that loves its crown more than its queen. You follow her down the hall. The air smells faintly of beeswax and fear. She nods to courtiers whose names she can't remember. They bow just low enough to be proper, but never long enough to show respect. Her foreign accent becomes a rumor. Her religion becomes a weapon. Her mannerisms, the way she tilts her head, the way she laughs, are dissected like state secrets. Catherine of Braganza drank tea. The English mocked her for it. Catherine de' Medici brought Italian cooks to France. The French called her the Poison Queen. Marie Antoinette preferred light dresses and informal picnics. The Parisians said she was mocking the poor. Royal women never won. If they were solemn, they were cold. If they smiled, they were frivolous. If they wept, they were manipulative. And if they didn't, well, then they were heartless. Historians still argue whether the cruelty of royal courts came from jealousy or fear, maybe both. A foreign bride was always a question mark in the royal household, too foreign to trust, too visible to ignore. You can almost hear the whispers echoing down the corridors. She writes to her homeland still. She prays in her own language. She brought strange servants with her. She doesn't know how to bow properly. Each rumour sticks like frost, layer upon layer, until she's coated in a chill that no fire can melt. At the grand dinners, she sits beside her husband, smiling so softly it almost hurts to hold. The courtiers laugh at jokes in a language she doesn't understand. She laughs too, just a heartbeat too late. A courtier's wife notices and smirks. You want to reach across the table to whisper, "You're doing fine," but the Queen doesn't hear you. Her eyes stay fixed on her plate, where the gold-rimmed dishes reflect a version of her that looks serene, but hollow. The foreign queens often became the subjects of political theatre. They were painted in elaborate portraits to prove their loyalty, paraded through streets to reassure the people that peace still held. But those same crowds that cheered at their arrival could turn within days. One quirky fact: in the Tudor court, ambassadors were known to report not just a queen's political activities, but her facial expressions. A Spanish envoy once described Anne Boleyn as having eyes too sharp for a woman of virtue. Historians still argue whether that was a compliment or a warning. And in Russia, when the German Princess Sophie of Anhalt-Zerbst became Catherine the Great, she faced years of suspicion. Her husband, Peter III, mocked her for her accent and taste in books. The courtiers gossiped that she was too intelligent to be trusted, which in hindsight might have been their first accurate observation. You walk beside our lonely queen as she crosses the marble floor of the audience chamber. Every footstep echoes like a judgment. She bows to her husband as protocol demands, but he barely glances at her. His advisers talk over her, discussing trade, alliances, the treasury, as if she were a painting on the wall. She once tried to speak, to offer an opinion on the new schools being built in the countryside. The silence that followed was so sharp it could have cut her in half. That was the day she learned the first rule of surviving a cold court. Speak only when silence would be worse. At night, she walks through the palace gardens, not the public ones, but the inner courtyard where the statues of past queens stand in neat rows. She wonders if they all felt this same isolation. The wind moves through the leaves, whispering in a tongue she can almost understand. There's a legend about one of those statues, a queen who supposedly turned to stone rather than spend another winter ignored. Of course, it's nonsense. But some nights, when the moonlight hits just right, the marble seems to shimmer with something like recognition. The guards call her Her Majesty, the Silent Star. They think it's flattering. It's not. You can tell she's starting to fade inward. The spark she carried from her homeland, the quick wit, the laughter, the tiny rebellions, is dimming under all this formality. She begins keeping a journal, hidden behind a loose panel in her writing desk. Not for rebellion, just to remember who she is. She writes about the garden, the smells of the kitchens, the sound of the clock tower bell. Small things, safe things. But one evening, she finds her journal missing. The next day, a new servant appears, and one she doesn't recognize. The message is clear: we see you. From that moment, she starts performing her role flawlessly. She laughs at the right jokes, kneels at the right prayers, smiles just enough to seem content. It's the most convincing act of her life. And yet, beneath the layers of obedience, something stirs. A tiny ember, faint but steady, a quiet refusal to disappear completely. She starts visiting the chapel more often, not for prayer, but for silence. The echo of her footsteps becomes her only confidant. If you close your eyes, you can almost hear her whisper to herself, barely audibly, "I'm still here." Outside the chapel, the courtiers gossip about her again. They call her strange, aloof, cold. But you know the truth. The cold isn't hers. It belongs to them. You wake to a sound that doesn't belong in the palace, a hush that isn't silence exactly, but the weight of something missing. Servants tiptoe in the corridors, their shoes soft as sighs. Somewhere down the hallway a door opens and closes once, then never again. Something's happened. The queen's husband, the man she was married to but never really met, is dead. This is when the groom never shows up. The strangest chapter of all, because in royal marriages, death doesn't always end things. Sometimes it begins them. You follow her down the hall. Her gown trails behind like spilled moonlight. The courtiers bow as she passes, their faces solemn, almost eager. Death is opportunity at court. It reshuffles everything. But for her, it's confusion. She barely knew him. They spoke 3 sentences, maybe 4, since their wedding day. He left for war, or illness, or exile, depending on which rumor you believe. Now he's gone, and the entire kingdom demands that she mourn for a man she never touched. Her ladies-in-waiting dress her in black. Not soft mourning grey or somber navy, no, black as a void, heavy with jet beads that click when she moves. The veil covers her face completely. She's expected to weep, to collapse, to appear appropriately inconsolable. But how do you mourn a ghost? Historians still argue about Anne of Brittany, twice a Queen of France, who married Charles VIII, then Louis XV after Charles's sudden death. Did she love either of them, or simply love the idea of surviving them? You can almost hear her voice echo across centuries. I was queen before, and I will be again. Your queen, our quiet protagonist, doesn't have Anne's defiance. Not yet. She sits on the edge of her bed, while priests murmur Latin, and courtiers debate whether her mourning gown should include silver trim. One suggests white instead of black because, in some kingdoms, white is the colour of royal grief. It looks more pure, he says. She doesn't answer. All she wants is a letter, any letter from home. But no one dares bring it now. One strange thing about these deaths. Sometimes the wedding happened after the groom had already died. They called it a proxy marriage, a legal fiction where a stand-in husband, usually a cousin or ambassador, spoke the vows on the dead man's behalf. It sounds absurd, but it wasn't uncommon. In 1499, Mary Tudor, sister of Henry VIII, was married by proxy to the aging King Louis XIII of France. By the time she arrived in Paris, her husband was already ill and would die less than 3 months later. Her entire marriage fit neatly between a ceremony and a funeral, and yet her life afterward became legend. She secretly married the man she truly loved, Charles Brandon, Duke of Suffolk, risking execution to do so. Historians still argue whether it was love or rebellion that drove her. But it's nice to think it was both. Not every widow found freedom, though. Some became royal relics, living symbols of dynasties that didn't exist anymore. You walk with our queen into the funeral procession. The streets are lined with people clutching candles, their eyes darting between grief and curiosity. They whisper about her beauty, her calm, her accent. She can feel their gaze like a physical weight. The coffin passes, draped in cloth of gold. She follows as protocol dictates, head bowed, veil trembling. The church bells toll, a sound too slow to be alive. But inside her head, another sound rises, the scraping of ink on paper. The letters that never came, the life she never lived. In a cruel twist, she's suddenly more visible than ever. Mourning makes her a spectacle. Courtiers whisper, she will be remarried soon. The alliance must continue. A widow's hand is never idle for long. It happens faster than she expects. Within weeks, ambassadors arrive again, men with fur collars and sharpened smiles. They bow low and say things like, Your Majesty's devotion to our late lord proves her virtue. His brother, naturally, would be honoured to... She doesn't even let them finish. Her fingers tighten on the armrest. The word no burns behind her teeth, though she doesn't say it aloud. Queens don't get to say no. Still, something in her eyes must give her away because one of the envoys falters. Later, alone, she tears off her veil and walks to the window. The sky outside is the colour of tin. The courtyard below looks exactly the same as it did yesterday and the day before. Only the faces have changed. You notice something strange. She doesn't cry. She did all her crying before the marriage, before the journey, before the silence. There's nothing left in her now but exhaustion and clarity. And that's when she understands the truth every royal bride eventually learns. Grief, in this world, is just another performance. In Spain, widowed queens were sent to convents for reflection. In England, they were expected to remain at court until the next alliance was arranged. In Russia, they were sometimes forced into nunhood to prevent them from remarrying into rival families. The crown never let go of its possessions, not even its broken ones. One quirky tidbit, Catherine of Aragon, after Prince Arthur's death, lived for 7 years in a strange half-status, neither wife nor widow, just the Princess Dowager. Her dowry remained unpaid, her future undecided. She wrote letter after letter to her father, each one more desperate than the last. Most never arrived. You can almost hear her whispering through the walls of time the same way your queen does now. I am still here, but I do not know who I am. The courtiers knock at her door, announcing that supper is served. She doesn't answer. They knock again. The sound echoes like a drumbeat of obedience. Finally, she says softly, "Tell them I am praying." She isn't. She's writing again, this time not a letter, but a single sentence repeated over and over. He never came to me, but they will still call me his. When she's done, she folds the paper and places it inside a small silver locket. A keepsake of nothing. Outside, the bells stop tolling. The city exhales, and somewhere deep in the quiet of the palace, another queen begins her own story. Another bride boards another ship. Another portrait is painted. Because in this world the men may die, but the arrangements live forever. The morning smells of wax and roses are too clean, too still. The hallways echo with a strange kind of ceremony, one that feels rehearsed and hollow at the same time. You follow her down the corridor again, though she's not a bride now, not yet a widow either. She's something in between, a woman still tethered to a ghost. This is the world of proxy weddings, where vows are spoken by strangers, rings are slipped onto borrowed fingers, and the bride and groom may never even breathe the same air. You're standing in a chapel that looks like every other royal chapel. Gilded ceiling, marble floor, candles arranged with obsessive symmetry. But at the altar stands not her husband, not even a man she knows, but his envoy, a solemn nobleman with nervous hands. He bows stiffly. He's the groom for the day. The bride curtsies, the gown whispering as it folds around her ankles. Her heart beats fast, not because she's in love, but because the ceremony feels like an illusion that might shatter if she exhales too loudly. The priest speaks in Latin, the same old script. The envoy repeats each vow as though reading a list of trade agreements. Then he slips a ring onto her finger, her husband's ring, borrowed for the occasion. She murmurs her part of the ritual, her voice steady, her pulse not. The witnesses applaud politely, and just like that she's married to a man who isn't even there. Historians still argue whether proxy marriages were an act of devotion or convenience, probably both. They save time, money, and occasionally lives. Wars could be prevented before the bride ever left her homeland. If she died en route, the treaty still held. Bureaucracy, ever the romantic. Catherine of Aragon, remember her? She was married by proxy to Prince Arthur of England in 1499, 2 years before they met in person. The ceremony was performed in Spain. Arthur's stand-in was the ambassador, donned in ceremonial armour. When the vows were exchanged, he even lifted his leg into the bed afterward, as custom required, to symbolize consummation. You can almost hear the uncomfortable coughs that followed. That was the rule. To make a royal marriage binding, the bed must be touched, even symbolically. You can feel the absurdity of it standing here centuries later. This ritual so solemn, so ridiculous, and yet taken with dead seriousness. For the diplomats, this was politics. For the bride, it was possession. When the ceremony ends, the bells ring out across the courtyard, and messengers gallop off with scrolls announcing the union. Trumpets blare, the court cheers. Somewhere, a painter begins a new portrait of her, already calling her by her husband's title. But the husband? He might not even know it's over. He could be at war, or sick, or indifferent. Sometimes these unions lasted years before the couple ever met. In rare cases, they never met at all. One example. In 1721, the Russian Tsarevich Peter married Charlotte of Brunswick-Lüneburg by proxy. They met once, awkwardly, after the fact, and Peter was dead within months. Charlotte, left stranded in a court that despised her, wandered aimlessly through palaces that had already forgotten her. Another, in 1810, Napoleon married Marie-Louise of Austria, also by proxy. He wasn't even on the same continent. She bowed to an empty chair, draped with his cloak. When they finally met weeks later, he reportedly declared, "You are better than your portrait," which, by Napoleonic standards, was romance. You can almost laugh, gently, sleepily, at the absurdity of it all. Marriage by mail, romance by courier. A lifetime decided before first sight. The Queen, though, doesn't laugh. She's sitting now in her chamber, staring at her hand. The ring feels cold, too heavy for what it means. Her ladies congratulate her. "You are now the mother of nations." She smiles, because that's what's expected, but the words don't land. She feels like a ghost in her own wedding story, present only in name. That night, a banquet is held in her honor. Toasts are made, poems recited. Someone even releases doves. She pretends to sip wine, but it tastes like iron. Later, when the guests have left and the candles are down to stubs, she walks barefoot through the silent corridor. Her reflection in the mirrors seems to multiply. A dozen versions of her in different gowns, different expressions. None of them look alive. She stops by a window. The moonlight pools across the floor, white and sharp as spilled milk. She leans her forehead against the cold glass and whispers, almost to herself, "If this is marriage, then what was the ceremony for?" Outside, a single snowflake drifts past. Winter has arrived again, just as it always does, regardless of vows or crowns. And that's when she notices something strange. Despite all the rules, despite the priest's words and the witnesses' signatures, she doesn't feel married. Not to him, at least. But to something else. Duty, silence, expectation. Proxy marriage wasn't just symbolic for her. It became her entire life. She was always speaking vows for someone else, living through stand-ins, being loved through intermediaries. One historian wrote that proxy weddings made queens before they became women. Another argued that they erased the line between reality and ritual. Both were right. You can almost hear the echo of those ghostly ceremonies still. All those brides bowing to empty thrones, reciting vows to men far away. The echoes are soft, but endless. And tonight, she dreams of one of them. A girl in another century, another kingdom, standing before an altar, saying, "I do," to the air. When she wakes, her hand is still clutching the ring. It leaves a faint mark on her skin. Not love, not memory, just pressure. The kind that never fades. You wake to the hush of morning inside her chamber, a space that gleams and suffocates at the same time. Gold leaf crawls up the walls. The air smells faintly of myrrh and polished cedar, and light filters through glass, so thick it softens the sun into something pale and distant. This is the world she lives in now, the world of silken prisoners. You walk quietly behind her as she moves through rooms she technically owns, yet can't escape. Every corridor leads to another corridor. Every window is barred, not visibly, but by decorum, by expectation, by the invisible hands of those who would never let her walk too far unchaperoned. Her gowns are exquisite, heavy with pearls. Her meals are lavish, served on plates so thin they ring when touched. But she's not free. She's contained, preserved like a delicate relic. A queen's prison, you realize, never needed locks. Her schedule is fixed to the minute. Morning prayers, audiences, embroidery lessons, inspections of household accounts, short walks under supervision, evening suppers, and late-night mass. Everything timed, everything observed. The ladies-in-waiting follow her everywhere, an entourage of witnesses disguised as companions. Even her sleep is supervised. Her bedchamber must never be empty, in case she requires assistance. Translation, in case she tries to run. And why would she? It's not as if the world beyond these walls would recognize her anymore. She has her jewels, her tapestries, her chamber musicians, and yet she's lonelier than any peasant in the fields outside the palace gates. You can hear the faint rustle of parchment as a clerk in the next room records her every expenditure: candles, gloves, lace, ink. Every expense becomes proof of her virtue or her vanity. In royal courts, a woman's restraint was her currency. The fewer pleasures she sought, the holier she appeared. Even joy had to be politically correct. One mainstream historical fact: in the court of Spain, Queen Mariana of Austria was required to maintain a household of nearly 600 attendants, not for luxury, but surveillance. They documented her every word, movement, and expression so that any impropriety could be noted. She spent most of her adult life behind curtains and confessionals, the human embodiment of protocol. You imagine her walking those long halls, her skirts whispering over cold stone. Every echo feels like a reminder that she exists only through others: her husband's title, her father's treaty, her people's expectations. Our queen, your queen now because you've followed her this far, has learned to smile on command. The smile is perfect, soft, subtle, camera-ready centuries before cameras existed. But behind it, something sharp has begun to stir. She writes less now, too risky. Instead, she watches, she listens, she collects details like pebbles. Which minister hesitates before bowing? Which maid looks afraid when delivering messages? Which priest coughs before lying? The court believes she's fragile. They've mistaken silence for fragility. One quirky tidbit: the French Queen Anne of Austria once built a hidden passageway between her chambers and the chapel so she could visit the confessional unobserved. The tunnel was discovered years later, its walls lined with faint candle soot. Historians still argue whether she used it to pray or to plot. You'd like to believe both. At dinner, the Queen sits beneath a canopy of estate, a literal roof of cloth suspended over her chair, marking her as divine. No one else is allowed to sit beneath it. Even her husband must sit slightly lower. It's a performance of hierarchy so subtle it's almost invisible, and yet it defines the air in the room. The musicians play softly and the courtiers laugh at jokes too sharp to be honest. She laughs too, just enough to be polite. The wine tastes like iron again. The candles tremble. Every so often she glances toward the heavy drapes that conceal the windows. Beyond them she can hear the faint chatter of the city. The people outside have no idea she spends her days rehearsing smiles like a stage actress in an endless play. Historians still argue whether Marie Leschinska, Queen of France, ever truly spoke to her husband Louis XV after their first year of marriage. Some say she simply disappeared into the etiquette of the palace, a ghost who attended her own dinners. Her silence was mistaken for meekness, but maybe it was the only rebellion left to her. You picture your queen, the one whose story you've been following, sitting in her dressing chamber now, her hair being braided for yet another formal audience. The ladies chatter about court gossip, but she doesn't listen. Her gaze drifts to the mirror. She hardly recognizes the reflection, the jewels, the stiff bodice, the polished grace. They've built a version of her that no longer fits. And then she sees something else in the mirror, movement behind her, a servant watching, always watching. She doesn't flinch, she simply lifts her chin a fraction higher. That's the unspoken art of royal survival. Never show what you notice. After the attendants leave, she slips off the crown and holds it in her hands. It's beautiful, cold, and surprisingly heavy. The velvet inside has molded to her shape. as if even the metal has learned to imprison her gently. Outside, the bells ring for evening prayers, the same as yesterday, the same as every day. She sets the crown down carefully on the table and whispers to herself, almost like a secret vow, "One day I will move without permission." The words vanish into the silence, but not before they take root. You can almost see it, the faint flicker in her eyes, the slow return of something dangerous, awareness. A silken prisoner she may be, but silk can tear. And tonight she dreams of the sound it makes when it finally does. The night begins with perfume, thick, sweet, almost choking, and ends with ink. Somewhere beyond the closed door of her bedchamber, the court continues to hum like a hive, pages running errands, footmen polishing silver, guards gossiping about things they shouldn't know. But inside it's only her, the smell of rose oil, and a letter she isn't supposed to write. This is the age of perfumed letters and political ghosting, those quiet, desperate correspondences that travelled farther than love ever could, only to die at the borders of power. You sit across from her at the small inlaid desk, the candle between you trembling as if it's nervous to witness. She's dressed in her shift now, hair loose, skin pale from too many sleepless nights. The air tastes faintly of ink dust and sadness. Her hand shakes as she begins. "My lord, it has been many weeks since your last word. I fear I have offended you without knowing how." The words begin as diplomacy, soft, formal, folded in courtesy. Then something slips, the letters grow smaller, the lines tilt downward. Or perhaps I was never meant to know you at all. You almost want to stop her, to remind her that these letters are intercepted, read, archived, but she already knows. That's the point. If the spies must read them, let them choke on her honesty. Perfumed paper was the luxury of the century, ambergris, violets, crushed cloves, pressed into the pulp before it dried. A letter could carry the scent of its sender across continents. When a royal courier opened one, the fragrance clung to his gloves for days, like invisible treason. Historians still argue whether Queen Christina of Sweden ever sent her scented manifestos to her would-be lovers, or if later collectors forged them for scandal. What's certain is that perfume and secrecy always mixed too well. Our queen signs the page carefully, sprinkles sand to dry the ink, and presses the paper to her lips before folding it. Not out of romance, but ritual. She seals it with a small circle of blue wax, her private colour, the shade of her homeland's dawn. Tomorrow, the letter will disappear into the palace courier system, where messages go to be censored, delayed, or misplaced. And she'll wait again, counting the days until absence becomes proof of punishment. One quirky detail: in the Spanish court of Philip II, royal correspondents were required to number every paragraph so that the king could respond point by point. When affection crept in between the numbers, the secretaries scratched it out in black ink. Imagine reading your own heart, redacted into bullet points. She blows out the candle and walks to the window. The glass fogs with her breath. Outside, the city is asleep beneath a blanket of fog and chimney smoke. Somewhere beyond that haze is the man she's supposed to call husband, alive, absent, indifferent. She whispers into the glass, tracing the fog with one finger. "You don't even know my handwriting." In that moment, the palace feels enormous. Every door locked from the outside, every hallway lined with listeners. But letters are small enough to escape. So she writes more. Dozens. Some start as pleas, others as little essays about weather, gardens, books. She quotes philosophers she half understands, hides small jokes between lines. Sometimes she writes in code, lemon juice ink, invisible until heated. Once, she hides a note inside a hollow wax fruit from the kitchen display, and sometimes, when the answers never come, she writes replies herself, folds them carefully, seals them, tucks them into the drawer. Not delusion exactly, just rehearsal for a world that might have been kind. One night, a guard finds a page she's dropped by mistake. He hands it to the steward to the secretary to the council. By morning, the letter has been copied 6 times and filed under irregular correspondence of Her Majesty. They read her metaphors for loneliness as coded espionage. Her references to gardens become maps. Her lines about sleeplessness, "I hear footsteps that stop at my door," are marked as possibly prophetic. Historians still argue whether that archive of mistranslated heartbreak changed policy. It did, in a way. The king's advisors decide that her mental stability must be monitored more closely. You watch her discover this new cage through kindness. The courtiers smile more now. Her attendants bow deeper. The walls tighten invisibly. She doesn't cry. She starts using blander ink, thicker paper. Her letters become shorter, emptier. Eventually, she stops sending them all together. But she keeps one, the first one she ever wrote, to remind herself that once, for a few trembling minutes, she told the truth. When she reads it again years later, the perfume is faint, almost gone. Only the salt of her tears remains, the chemical proof that she existed between the lines. Outside, the wind picks up, carrying the smell of rain through the window crack. You can almost hear the rustle of all those lost letters drifting through history, ink ghosts, perfume fading, messages that never reached the men they were meant for. You lean closer to the candle's dying glow, watching her fold the final page, whispering the same sentence she always does before sealing it. "If I must vanish, let the paper remember me." And then she presses her ring into the wax, marking the letter with her name, so that at least something will speak when she no longer can. Dawn creeps in through the thin lace curtains, pale and unkind. The Queen is already awake, though she hasn't slept. You can tell by the way her shoulders slope forward, by the half-empty ink bottle still on her desk, and by the faint outline of the moon still visible outside her window, like a witness reluctant to leave. She stares down at her hands. They look older than they should. The veins beneath the skin rise like rivers on a map she no longer knows how to read. Today's subject, whispered behind every closed door and embroidered into every smile, is the heir problem. A queen without a child, after all, is a kingdom without a future. You can feel it in the way the air itself has changed. The faint pressure, like a storm waiting to break. The courtiers' glances are sharper now. The priests are gentler in their questions, which only makes them crueler. Even the maids watch her closely, as if trying to see through her gown to whatever secret she's keeping in her womb. At breakfast, no one mentions it directly, but every dish on the table seems symbolic. Eggs, almonds, figs. The old midwife superstition of fertility served on a silver tray. She doesn't touch any of it. Her husband still doesn't come to her chamber. It's been months, maybe years. Time in palaces has a way of folding in on itself. He dines alone, hunts, plays chess with advisers, attends confession, and sometimes appears beside her in public, smiling stiffly as if to prove they still share something. But behind the ceremony lies the truth. They are two separate countries forced to share a bed they never occupy together. And now the question of succession hangs over everything. One mainstream historical fact: Anne of Cleves' marriage to Henry VIII was annulled, in part because it was never consummated. When the king declared the union void, he claimed she was not as he had been informed. Translation: she wasn't what the portrait promised. She was humiliated publicly, labelled the king's sister, and quietly retired. Our queen knows this story well. Every royal woman does. There are precedents. There are precedents for everything. Queens who took lovers to secure heirs, queens who claimed miraculous conceptions, queens who faked pregnancies altogether, padding their gowns with linen until the court could no longer bear the suspense. She will not do that. And yet the whispers grow. Perhaps she is barren. Perhaps she is cursed. Perhaps she does not even try. Historians still argue whether these rumours were born of politics or superstition. The truth is simpler. Power always demands someone to blame, and women are wonderfully convenient targets. The Queen walks through the palace garden, her steps slow, deliberate. The roses are dying this time of year, their petals curled and brown at the edges. She brushes one gently, as though apologizing. A little boy runs past, the son of a courtier, laughing, chasing a hoop. His laughter echoes through the marble arches, pure and cruel in its innocence. Her ladies-in-waiting exchange glances. One murmurs something about future princes. The Queen says nothing. She's learned the art of silence too well. Inside her private chapel, she kneels, not to pray, but to think. The air is cool, the scent of incense faint. She looks up at the painted Virgin on the ceiling, serene, round-bellied, surrounded by angels. The artist made her beautiful, glowing, eternal. The Queen almost laughs. Even God's mother had to prove herself by giving birth, she whispers. One quirky tidbit. In 17th century France, royal births were public spectacles. When the Queen went into labour, courtiers crowded into her chamber to witness it, ensuring the heir was legitimate. When Marie-Thérèse, wife of Louis XIV, gave birth, over 200 people were present. 200. Privacy was a luxury reserved for failure. Imagine it, the pain, the fear, the endless eyes. History, quite literally, watching. Our Queen lies awake that night, staring at the canopy above her bed. The embroidered cherubs stare back, plump and smirking. She wonders if they were designed to mock her. Her husband's footsteps echo faintly in the hall outside. For a second, her heart lifts. Maybe he'll come in, maybe tonight he'll stay. But the footsteps fade. The latch never turns. Later, she hears the laughter of courtiers drifting from the far wing, his wing. A woman's laughter, among them, higher, silkier. She closes her eyes. Historians still argue whether royal mistresses were enemies or allies of the queens they replaced. Some, like Madame de Pompadour, served as unofficial advisers. Others simply became reminders of what queens were not allowed to be. Desired. In the darkness, the Queen whispers to herself. They think power lies in a child, but it lies in patience. And maybe she's right. Over the next months, she begins to adapt. She visits the nursery wing often, not for her own child, she has none, but for the courtiers' children. She learns their names, their stories, their fears. The servants start to talk. The Queen is kind. Her kindness becomes her disguise. Behind it, she gathers information. Which duke is in debt, which lady is secretly in love, which adviser cheats at cards. She builds an invisible web of understanding, delicate as lace, and waits. Because one thing every silken prisoner eventually learns. If you cannot bear an heir, you must birth influence. And so, when the next council meets and her husband sits in silence, she speaks for the first time in months. Her tone is soft but firm. The ministers listen, they nod, and though she doesn't smile, not even slightly, you can feel it, the faint crack in her invisible walls. She may never be a mother, but she's beginning to remember that she was never meant to be only that. The bells outside strike midnight. The moon shifts higher, cutting through the curtains in thin, sharp lines of silver. She places her hand on her stomach, not in sorrow anymore, but as if to steady herself against the weight of something she's just begun to feel again. Agency. For the first time, her emptiness doesn't frighten her. It feels like space. You hold the locket to your chest like a small, heavy planet, a private gravity that tugs the edges of your days. It was once a trinket, a pretty thing inlaid with a miniature portrait and a curl of hair. But now it hums with the secret life of everything you aren't allowed to say aloud. You press your thumb to the enamel and remember the hands that have never actually touched yours. Keepsakes were the quiet currency of brides who never met their husbands. When mouths were watched and letters disappeared, a lock of hair or a tiny painted portrait became a whole conversation. Think of them as the 16th century text message, small, immediate, and often misread by everyone in between. A mainstream fact, it was common for betrothed couples to exchange tokens, rings, gloves, miniature portraits, meant to symbolize fidelity and connection across distance. These objects traveled as proof when words could not. You tuck your own tiny token into a page of a poetry book and shut the cover, pretending not to notice how your fingers linger where the paper meets the binding. For a moment you imagine a royal marketplace app where a locket's listing reads, "Slightly used, emotional value only, scent not included." Then you picture a courier trying to smuggle it past customs like contraband chocolate, and you wonder whether a medieval eBay ever hosted auctions for dynastic trinkets. The absurdity makes you smile. A small, private rebellion. Historians still argue whether these tokens were sentimental or strategic. Some scholars insist a lock of hair was pure affection, a tiny, human protest against politics, while others suggest it functioned as a pledge, a form of insurance that proved fidelity or created obligation. The truth is messy and human. People are both sentimental and strategic at once. There were stranger keepsakes, the sorts of objects that sound like the plot of a Gothic novella. Brides sometimes received love knots, silken cords knotted in particular patterns and kept under pillows to ward off bad fortune. Gloves embroidered with mottos were tucked into bedding for luck. A Portuguese princess is said to have sent a small wooden heart carved from an olive tree. The envoy reported it smelled faintly of home, which made the whole thing feel tender rather than theatrical. Then there are the darker tales, the ones that later generations treat like gossip because they're useful, unreliable, and delicious. In some courts, relics of the body were oddly sentimentalized, rings pulled from the fingers of deceased relatives, or, in one macabre anecdote, a bone wrapped in silk and sent as a pledge. You can picture the courier at customs, sweating, stuffing the parcel into a crate labelled linens. The absurdity of it makes you laugh when you shouldn't. A nervous little joke tucked into the margins of grief. Not all tokens were morbid. Miniature portraits painted on vellum could be slipped into lockets and passed with the utmost discretion. Artists learned to paint a life in a thumbnail, a single eyelash, a tiny catchlight that made the eyes look alive. The craft was so precise that one delicate brushstroke could change how a whole marriage began. It's odd to think that an artist's steady hand had the power to start wars, or avert them. Scent was a kind of invisible keepsake. Sachets stuffed with herbs, citrus peel, and bay leaves travelled in trunks and under collars. A sachet's aroma could become the memory of a person at 50 paces. It was both intimate and ridiculous. Historians still argue whether certain scent combinations were coded signals between lovers or simply fashionable. Either way, a remembered smell clung to cloaks through months of travel and returned as ghostly proof of presence. You begin to stash more than trinkets. A scrap of your sister's dress, a pressed wildflower, a scrap of a letter you'll never send, eh? These are tiny refugees of the life you left. You hide them in hollowed beams, behind loose stones in the seams of candle stands. Memory becomes an archive no secretary can burn. Sometimes a token became evidence. A lock of hair slipped into a drawer could later be pulled out in court as proof of impropriety. A hidden letter discovered during a search could exile a woman or restore her reputation. Intimacy and accusation live dangerously close together in the palaces. An object that once comforted can later condemn. Yet tokens are also acts of rebellion. You sew a ribbon from a homeland skirt into the hem of a gown as a secret signature, and in years to come, you can trace your old life by that one thread. You carve initials on a chapel pew where no prince will sit. These small resistances accumulate, quiet as coins in a jar, until one day they buy you a piece of yourself back. One evening, a servant brings you a miniature portrait from a distant cousin, an oval of painted ivory with a laugh line you thought had vanished from your face. He hands it over with trembling hands as if it might explode into accusations. You hold it close, squinting to see how the artist captured the tilt of a smile, the shadow at the corner of an eye. You laugh softly, surprised to find your voice again. The sound startles the cats asleep beneath the table. The tokens gather, lockets in drawer corners, sachets in pillows. A pressed violet between two pages, they become an informal family. Keepsakes speaking the language you were forbidden to use. When officials inventory your possessions, they pass over these small things with polite efficiency because plate and parchment count as state property. Love curiosities are just clutter. You keep them hidden in places that look unremarkable, the seam of a mattress, the hollow of a candlestick, the underside of a drawer. Sometimes a token returns with news. A handkerchief embroidered with a place name matches a courier's rumour. A pressed blossom brings the memory of a garden now burned in war. A ring dropped through a moonlit window with a note reading, "I am coming," is more dangerous than any pact. Whether that promise is fulfilled is another story. Historians still argue about one particularly famous locket whose inscription caused scandal. But the object's gravity remains. It tugs at you, even in sleep. You wind the chain of your locket around your finger until it leaves a faint groove. It's the only mark you can own without permission. The palace may strip you of titles, seal your letters, and monitor your prayers, but it cannot unmake the small, private rotations of memory you carry beneath your garments. Outside, the city shifts from candlelight to lamp oil, and the guards change watch. In the courtyard, a courier jokes with his fellows, the kind of laugh that rings like a coin. You imagine the parcel he carries, a ridiculous little human story tucked inside wax and paper, travelling towards someone who may or may not receive it. The thought comforts you, and you sleep with the locket pressed to your palm. When morning arrives, you open the locket and trace the tiny face set within. It looks like you when you forget to be careful. Softer, less practiced. You whisper its name into the metal and tuck it back because some proofs are only alive in private. The collection of tokens never replaces a home, but each one is a thread in the map that keeps you whole. They are proof that you were here, that you mattered to someone beyond politics, and that your life contained small pockets of warmth despite the cold stone around you. Tonight you close the drawer and breathe, listening to the household sleep. The locket's tiny planet rests against your pulse. It orbits slowly, a quiet companion for the long, otherwise empty hours. The palace wakes with the sound of laughter, low, male laughter echoing down the marble corridor like a reminder of everything she isn't. It's the hour before breakfast, that strange, too bright time when the servants are pretending not to notice, and the courtiers are pretending not to gossip. She knows what it means, that laughter. She doesn't need to ask. This is the mistress's parade, the cruel theatre that begins when kings remember that queens are made for duty, but mistresses are made for joy. You follow her through the corridor as she walks, slow and measured, her slippers whispering against the cold tiles. The air smells of musk and lilies, an imported scent, fashionable, excessive. She can taste its sweetness before she even reaches the ballroom. Inside, the king's courtiers are assembled, radiant in gold and silver. And there, at the centre of it all, is her, the mistress. She's young, of course she's young. Her gown is scandalously light, the colour of peaches in sunlight. The courtiers call her charming. The priests call her dangerous. But everyone agrees. She makes the king smile. The queen doesn't flinch, not here, not in public. She's been trained for this since birth. The art of watching her husband love someone else without letting her heartbeat show. In another life, maybe she would have been kind to the girl. Maybe she even is, secretly. But kindness in a palace is an act of war. It's interpreted, weighed, and weaponized. Historians still argue whether queens truly hated their husbands' lovers or whether they pitied them. Some did both. Catherine of Braganza prayed for Barbara Palmer, King Charles II's mistress, even as the woman strutted through court in the Queen's jewels. Others, like Eleanor of Aquitaine, fought back with cold strategy, turning scandal into leverage. Our Queen, though, simply watches. The mistress curtsies deeply, her smile bright and sharp. The king laughs, says something that makes the courtiers roar. Then he looks toward his wife, a flicker of guilt perhaps, or maybe just duty. He gestures to her, "My queen." Her title sounds like an apology. She steps forward, calm as a statue, her expression flawless. You can almost feel the strain behind it, every muscle held in obedience. She offers the mistress a polite nod. "Welcome to court," she says in a tone that could freeze wine. The mistress lowers her gaze, murmurs gratitude, and for a moment they lock eyes. Two women on opposite ends of the same blade. Later, the gossip begins. Servants whisper about who sat where, who blushed, who touched, whose sleeve. Every gesture becomes evidence. "The Queen smiled," someone says. Perhaps she approves. "She didn't touch her wine," says another. Perhaps she's furious. The Queen sits in her chambers as the rumours ripple through the palace like ripples in a poisoned pond. She removes her crown, sets it aside, and massages the red indent it leaves on her forehead. The sound of laughter from the courtyard floats up through the window again. Lighter this time, careless. You want to say something to her. Anything. But what comfort is there for a woman who must applaud her own humiliation? She turns to the mirror. "Do you think she's happy?" she whispers, almost to you. The girl with his hand on her waist? You don't answer, because you don't know. One quirky tidbit: in Versailles, the king's official mistress held her own apartments and court rank. She received ambassadors, influenced policy, and even had portraits commissioned in royal attire. Madame de Pompadour, for instance, controlled more state appointments than most ministers, all while being adored by the public and tolerated, even befriended by the Queen. Historians still argue whether this friendship was genuine or simply an act of survival. Our Queen decides to do something dangerous. She invites the mistress to tea. The court buzzes for days. Invitations are delivered by trembling messengers. Etiquette manuals are consulted. The meeting is scheduled for a Thursday afternoon, under the pretense of female harmony. Everyone expects a spectacle, The day arrives. The table is set with gold-rimmed china, sugared fruits, and the Queen's favourite tea. Strong, bitter, imported from far away. The mistress arrives in pale silk, looking nervous for the first time. The Queen gestures for her to sit. The conversation begins with harmless pleasantries, weather, fashion, poetry. Then, gently, the Queen leans forward. "You make him laugh," she says softly. "That's something I never could." The mistress stiffens. "Your Majesty?" "No," the Queen interrupts. "Don't flatter me. It's wasted breath." There's a pause. The air hums. Then, unexpectedly, the Queen smiles. Not coldly, not cruelly, but with something like pity. "You'll learn," she murmurs. "The laughter doesn't last. When it fades, they always come back to silence. That's where I live now." The mistress says nothing. Her teacup trembles slightly. And for the first time you realize they're both trapped, one in scandal, the other in propriety. Two halves of the same loneliness, performing opposite roles in the same endless play. When the tea ends, the mistress curtsies again, a little lower this time. She leaves quickly, head bowed. The Queen watches her go, then exhales. She pours the last of the tea into her saucer and stares at it. The ripples shimmer in the light, the scent faintly bitter. She whispers, "So much ceremony for a cup of nothing." That night, the court applauds her composure. The Queen was gracious, they say. How magnanimous she is. No one sees her later, sitting at her desk, writing one final letter she'll never send. They think laughter is power, but power is endurance. She folds the page and slides it into her prayer book. Not to hide it, but to consecrate it. Outside, the mistresses keep laughing, the king keeps smiling, the courtiers keep pretending. But inside her something has changed. She no longer wants affection. She wants understanding. And in the silence that follows, you understand her too, perhaps for the first time. Because grief shared between rivals is still grief. And sometimes the most dangerous act of all is forgiveness. The court wakes to the sound of thunder rolling over the city. A storm has gathered in the night, pressing low and heavy against the palace roofs. Inside, the marble corridors amplify every drop of rain into a kind of heartbeat. The Queen stands at her window, wrapped in a shawl, staring out at the grey dawn. The rain pools in the courtyard, where the flags hang limp. It looks as if even the weather has grown tired of ceremony. Today, the whispers are different. They don't hiss about mistresses or barren wombs. They hiss about blame. This is the reign of accidental villains, the chapter in every queen's story where the world decides her sorrow isn't enough, so it must also be her fault. The omens start small. A harvest fails. A comet passes. Someone's son dies at war, and the people, needing something tangible to hate, turn their eyes toward the woman in the gilded cage. It's her foreign gods, they say, her accent. Her dowry cursed the land. In candle-lit corners, the courtiers agree the Queen brings misfortune. Historians still argue whether this cycle of blame came from superstition or convenience. Probably both. Every crisis demanded a scapegoat, and no one made a better one than a woman with power she didn't ask for. The Queen knows what's happening before the first rumour reaches her ears. She's seen it before. She's read the letters from other queens, cousins, friends, strangers, bound by blood and politics. Their handwriting fades, but the stories don't. They loved me once. Then they starved. Then they hated me. She spends her mornings in the chapel now, kneeling until her knees ache on the cold stone. She prays not for forgiveness, but for patience. She prays to outlive the rumour, to let it wither like the roses in her garden. But the court moves faster than faith. A priest refuses her confession. A minister delays her correspondence. Servants begin to vanish from her wing of the palace, dismissed quietly, replaced with others who bow too low. One night she hears singing in the square beyond the palace walls. Not hymns, but chants, angry, rhythmic, rough. Foreign witch, cursed bride, cold queen. The torches flicker like fireflies of hatred. She stands behind the window, her reflection a ghost overlaid on the crowd. For a moment she wonders what would happen if she stepped outside, not in defense but simply to look at them. Would they still hate her if they saw how tired she is? How human? Probably. One quirky fact. In the 14th century, Queen Isabella of France, and the so-called she-wolf of France, was blamed for every misfortune that befell England during her marriage to Edward II. When wars failed and crops withered, people whispered that she'd cursed the realm with continental malice. Historians still argue whether she truly plotted against her husband or was simply written that way by men who needed a villain. Our Queen remembers that story too. She keeps a copy of a chronicle that calls Isabella faithless, though she suspects the chronicler never met a queen in his life. The storm outside rumbles louder now. A crash of thunder shakes the glass. Her husband hasn't spoken to her in days. When they cross paths, at mass, at council, at dinner, his eyes slide past her like she's part of the furniture. She doesn't need to be accused outright. Silence does the work just fine. She begins to understand how erasure works, not suddenly but in increments. It's not that anyone forbids her from speaking, it's that no one listens when she does. So she changes her tactics. When the council meets, she no longer argues. She sits still, hands folded, gaze calm. The men grow uneasy when there's power in stillness, and she's learning how to wield it. In private, she listens more than she speaks. Servants gossip around her, thinking she doesn't hear. Ministers underestimate her. Her husband's mistress brags to friends about the latest favour she's won. The Queen files it all away, not as revenge, but as inventory. She begins writing again, this time not letters, but observations, patterns, alliances, debts. A quiet ledger of power. She hides the pages in her prayer book. The next week another storm hits. A lightning strike sets part of the city ablaze. The people cry out again for someone to blame. A mob gathers outside the palace gates, shouting her name. The guards hold them back, but their faces betray what they really think. Maybe she did bring bad luck. Inside, the courtiers murmur that the king should send her away for her own safety. She waits. She knows the script. Queens vanish all the time. They're sent to convents, to remote castles, to silent exile under the guise of retreat. But this time something changes. The storm passes, the mob disperses. The king doesn't act. Instead, he falls ill. It's small at first, or do a fever, a cough, a shiver at night. The physicians murmur about humours, about the stars, about divine punishment. The irony doesn't escape her. The court panics. The same courtiers who called her cursed now flock to her for comfort. Pray for his majesty, they beg. Your devotion will heal him. And so she does, publicly, dutifully, flawlessly. She lights candles at every altar, kneels for hours until her spine aches, prays loud enough for witnesses to hear. Days pass. The king improves. The courtiers call it a miracle, her miracle. The chants outside turn from anger to awe. The crowd calls her the Blessed Queen. And there it is, the cycle complete. Cursed one week, sainted the next. She watches the rain ease from her window and murmurs, "All it takes to be holy is for someone else to hurt first." Historians still argue whether queens ever truly believed their own myths. The miracles, the curses, the divine favour. Maybe some did, but our Queen doesn't. She's learned that sainthood and witchcraft are the same story told by different survivors. Outside, thunder fades into the distance, rolling toward another kingdom that will one day need another villain. Inside, she folds her notes, blows out the candles, and sits in the dark, listening to the quiet. No matter what they call her tomorrow, blessed or cursed, wife or widow, she's still here. And in the long silence that follows, you realize that survival for women like her was never an act of grace. It was an act of defiance. The morning is fogged and heavy, the kind of pale, uncertain light that makes everything look like a memory. The Queen's footsteps echo softly through the long corridor as she makes her way toward the great hall, where ministers and maids already whisper in 2 different languages. The whispers, as always, are about her. This is the world of queens who never spoke the language, a realm built on misunderstanding, translation, and deliberate confusion, where every word becomes a weapon and every silence a shield. You can see it plainly as she enters the room, the quick glances, the careful bows, the translator already waiting beside her chair. He's a thin man with anxious eyes, clutching a notebook full of secrets he doesn't understand. His job is impossible, to make sense of hearts through grammar. She takes her seat, nods politely, and waits for the council to begin. The voices around her rise and fall in sharp, clipped syllables. She catches fragments, her name, the word funds, something about the provinces, but the rest blurs into sound. She turns to the interpreter. What are they saying? He hesitates, then offers the polite version. They are praising your wisdom, Majesty, which of course means the opposite. It always does. The first lesson every foreign queen learns is that courtiers lie more gracefully when they think you don't understand them. Historians still argue whether Anne of Cleves truly failed to learn English, or if she pretended ignorance to survive Henry VIII's temper. Either way, it worked. When the marriage collapsed, she was called simple, not treasonous. And simple women live longer than clever ones in royal courts. Our queen, though, is neither simple nor safe. She studies in secret, learns the rhythm of the language by listening to her maids, memorizes the shape of words on lips, practices pronunciation when no one's around. She even teaches herself to read it, tracing the ink of old documents at night by candlelight. Still she hides her understanding. Power, she's learned, comes from knowing more than anyone suspects. At supper, she lets them talk. The dukes joke, the ladies gossip. The king leans close to one of them and says something that makes her giggle. The queen smiles faintly and continues cutting her bread. She understands every word. Later that night, in her chamber, she laughs, quietly, bitterly. They think I am deaf, she tells her reflection. How peaceful it must be to be underestimated. Her mirror doesn't answer, but the woman looking back is no longer the naive girl who arrived by ship. Her eyes are sharper now, the blue of tempered steel. One quirky historical tidbit. When Catherine of Braganza first arrived in England, she was so isolated by language that her attendants had to mime her needs. Once, during dinner, she wanted chicken and flapped her arms like a bird. The courtiers laughed for weeks. Years later, when she finally learned English, she corrected a minister's grammar in front of the king. He never laughed again. Language, after all, is power, the kind that leaves no fingerprints. Our queen begins to use her new knowledge carefully. She listens more than she speaks. She picks up on phrases, funds reallocated, petition delayed, the queen's household reduced. Each word is a thread. She gathers them one by one until she has the whole web. Then, one morning, she strikes. The council is discussing a tax decree, one that will quietly strip her of her dowry income. She lets them speak for 20 minutes, pretending to glance idly at her gloves. Finally, when the Chancellor declares, "Her Majesty will, of course, agree," she looks up, and in flawless, unaccented language, she says, "Her Majesty does not." The room freezes. Every man at the table turns to stare. The translator fumbles with his papers, lost. She continues, calm as marble. "If the Treasury requires funds, perhaps the king's hunting stables could be reduced instead. I am told the horses eat better than the people." There's a murmur. Someone drops a quill. The king studies her. You're not angry, not impressed, just surprised, like he's seeing her for the first time. Historians still argue whether this meeting ever actually happened. Some say it's legend, a myth invented later to explain why the Queen's household suddenly regained funding. Others swear it's recorded in a surviving memorandum with a marginal note in the King's handwriting. She understands more than she should. Either way, the silence that follows becomes a turning point. From that day, they stop underestimating her, which is both a victory and a curse. The courtiers grow careful again, the servants nervous, the mistress watchful. The translator keeps his job but avoids her eyes. Even the king grows distant in a new way, not disdainful now but wary. Respect and fear are cousins who look alike in candlelight. In the evenings she practices reading aloud, softly, to no one. Poetry, mostly. Verses from her homeland, translated by her own hand. She stumbles sometimes, but her voice never falters. She reads one line over and over. A woman's silence is a country no map can capture. The words feel truer every time. Weeks pass, the fog lifts, the city begins to thaw into spring. And yet, the Queen doesn't feel freer. Knowledge hasn't released her. It's only made the bars of her cage visible. She still hears laughter outside her door, still receives censored letters, still eats beneath her husband's shadow. But she also hears the servants gossiping about her differently now. She's clever. She's dangerous. She listens. That last one is her favorite. One night, she dreams she's speaking to her younger self, the girl on the ship, crying into her sleeves. The girl says, "They will take everything from you." And the woman she's become answers, "Yes, but not my voice." When she wakes, the candle has burned out, the ink in her pen dried to a dark crust. The faint light of dawn creeps across the floor. Outside her window, the bells ring, not for her, not against her, just to remind her that time still moves, even when language stands still. She smiles faintly. For the first time, the sound of her own thoughts doesn't need translation, because now she understands everything, and she knows they will never understand her. The palace smells of lavender and secrets tonight. Down in the corridors, the candles sputter as the servants whisper, their voices low and quick as if afraid of the walls themselves. They say the Queen is unwell. They say her handmaid was seen leaving her chamber with red eyes. They say she's praying again. But not the way the priests taught her. They're wrong. She's not praying. She's planning. This is the age of the pregnancies of convenience. The quiet, scandalous twilight of dynasties where queens, desperate or defiant, sometimes created heirs by means no historian will admit out loud. You follow her through the room as she moves, slow, deliberate, in a gown of soft white. Her reflection catches in every mirror, a ghost among her own furniture. On her writing desk lies a half-finished letter addressed only to the future. The king hasn't visited her chambers in months. The mistresses have multiplied, the courtiers have stopped pretending to hope. Even the bishop, when he bows, does so out of pity rather than reverence. And yet somehow the Queen is smiling. Historians still argue whether royal bloodlines were ever truly pure, whether heirs were always legitimate, whether the crown ever cared about truth when the illusion was more useful. In France, in Spain, in Austria, in Russia, the stories echo the same way. A courtier lingers too long in the Queen's garden. A painter's portrait flatters too deeply. A musician stays after the performance. Then months later, a miracle is announced. The people cheer. The king accepts congratulations. The child is born with his father's eyes, whichever father the court chooses to see. Our queen knows this game. She doesn't play it, not yet. But she studies it the way a prisoner studies the guard's footsteps. She's not alone. Her chamberlain, a quiet man with a poet's eyes, has begun to linger at her side more often than etiquette allows. He reads to her in the afternoons when the king is away hunting. He brings her small things, a quill from his own desk, a sprig of rosemary for remembrance. When he speaks, he never looks directly at her, as if even his gaze could be treason. She should dismiss him. She doesn't. There's a tenderness in the way he listens, not to her words, but to her pauses. The silence between them grows heavier with each passing day. One evening, when thunder rumbles in the distance, he brings her a letter he's written himself. A poem, though he pretends it's an inventory. She reads it slowly, tracing the words with her finger. If love must live in shadow, let the candle burn from both ends. Her hands tremble as she folds it. She doesn't return it. She doesn't destroy it either. She just says quietly, "I understand, that's all." Nothing more. But the room changes after that, as though the air itself has discovered the meaning of longing. One quirky fact: in the late 16th century, rumours swirled that Anne of Denmark's children with King James VI were not all his, that gentlemen of the bedchamber had occasionally aided the line of succession. The accusations were never proven nor forgotten. Historians still argue whether this was political slander or coded truth. Our Queen knows how those stories are born. She knows, too, that history loves a scandal more than a sacrifice. So she waits. The months pass, the court grows restless again. The king's health falters, his temper sharpens. The mistress boasts too loudly. The queen, meanwhile, glows faintly in the candlelight, not joy, but purpose. Then one morning a rumour begins to spread, quiet at first, then louder. The queen, the barren queen, is with child. The court erupts in delight. Bells ring, the people cheer, ministers rush to prepare proclamations. The king, bewildered but flattered, sends her gifts. A necklace, a blessing, a cautious smile. He does not ask when, no one does, and she, serene as a saint, lets them believe what they need to. Historians still argue whether the child was truly royal. Some letters suggest the dates don't match. Some accounts hint at sudden generosity toward a certain poet chamberlain who conveniently retired soon after the birth. But none of it matters. What matters is the heir exists. Months later, in a chamber draped with gold, the queen gives birth to a son. The bells ring again, louder this time. Courtiers weep with relief. The midwives bow. The king smiles for the first time in years. And her chamberlain, wherever he is, writes one last anonymous line into his notebook. The candle burns still. For the rest of her life, she never names him. She never speaks of him. She never even glances toward his memory when the child toddles across the floor. But on quiet nights, when the palace sleeps, she takes out the folded poem and reads it again by candlelight. The edges are frayed, the ink faint, but the meaning is clear as ever. She whispers to the flame, "You were not my lover, you were my proof that I could still be alive." And maybe that's the truest thing about all the so-called convenient pregnancies of royal history. They weren't only about heirs, they were about survival, about claiming one small piece of agency in a world where even a woman's body belonged to the crown. You look at her now, and the Queen with her quiet smile, her secret intact, and realize she's not a sinner or a saint. She's something far rarer, a woman who outwitted history. The bells of the palace toll again, slowly, formally, with that measured dignity that makes even lies sound holy. Down in the council chamber, the scribes are sharpening their quills, and a messenger is already galloping toward the border with a sealed document. Another treaty, another marriage contract, another performance of power. This is the season of the fake weddings, the kind that never meant to bind anyone's heart, only their land. You stand beside her as she listens to the news. Somewhere to the north, a duchess has been married by proxy to a dead prince. To the east, a queen has been promised to a noble who doesn't exist. The ministers call these arrangements temporary measures, as if love itself were a line item that can be erased when politics change. The Queen says nothing, but her fingers curl slightly around the edge of her chair. She's seen this before, the way kingdoms create illusions so convincing that people build their lives around them. Her own son, now a toddler with bright, uncertain eyes, has become part of the same machinery. Courtiers bow too low when he toddles past. Ambassadors bring him gifts, not toys, but miniature suits of armor, gilded books, amulets of protection. He doesn't understand that he's already a symbol. And she, his mother, is a myth that keeps rewriting itself. Historians still argue whether the ghost marriages of the late Renaissance were deception or desperation. Sometimes a dowry was at stake, sometimes an alliance needed to appear whole on paper while armies prepared behind the scenes. A stand-in would speak the vows, a scribe would sign the record, and the bride would be none the wiser until the ink was dry. You imagine the ceremony, the candles burning, the witnesses solemn, the air thick with the smell of melted wax and deceit. The bride's veil trembles as the proxy groom says the words for her absent husband. Somewhere far away, the real groom doesn't even know he's married. The Queen once thought these stories were exaggerations, court gossip inflated by distance. Now she knows better. 2 nights ago, a courier brought her a letter from a neighboring court. The handwriting was careful, diplomatic, and cold. It congratulated her on her forthcoming union to a duke she's never met. The letter was addressed to Her Majesty the Dowager Queen, as if the man she once married had already died. It's not a mistake, it's a rehearsal. You can feel her fury vibrating in the stillness. She knows what's happening. Factions at court, eager to replace her influence, are preparing a marriage on paper that will strip her of property and title. Once the fiction becomes official, she'll be shipped away quietly, to a convent, a retreat, somewhere without mirrors. She walks to the window, opens it wide. The night air cuts in, smelling of rain and iron. Below, torches move along the palace wall, soldiers changing guard, oblivious to the plot unfolding above them. One quirky detail. In 1500 Spain, false marriages were sometimes undone by burning the very parchment that recorded them. If no proof existed, neither did the union. You picture her staring at the candle flame, weighing how easily history itself can be erased. She calls for her secretary. He enters, startled to see her pacing. She speaks softly, deliberately. Write this down, every date, every signature, every witness. He hesitates. Majesty, that could be dangerous. All truth is, she answers. For hours they record everything, the forged letters, the gossip, the sudden disappearances of her allies. She hides the papers in the lining of a prayer cushion, the one embroidered with lilies. When dawn comes, she looks exhausted, but calm. "They will call it scandal," she says, "but scandal is just truth with bad timing." The next week, the false wedding proceeds anyway. A stand-in priest, a stand-in bride. The contract signed in her name, sealed with a counterfeit mark. The courtiers cheer, the ambassadors nod approvingly. On paper, the kingdom has a new alliance. In reality, nothing has changed except her resolve. That night, while the revelry still hums through the lower halls, she walks to the chapel carrying a single candle and the forged marriage document she managed to retrieve through a sympathetic scribe. The paper shakes slightly in her hand as she holds it over the flame. It curls, blackens, and turns to ash. The smoke rises toward the painted ceiling, where saints stare down with unblinking eyes. "Let the record show," she whispers, "that I was never yours." Historians still argue about what happened next. Some say the forged alliance collapsed within days when no one could produce the contract. Others insist the Queen's allies exposed the conspiracy at court. A few romantic chroniclers claim she fled the palace entirely, disguised as a nun, carrying only her son and the ashes of her false marriage in a silver box. The truth is less dramatic, but more dangerous. She stayed. She attended Mass the next morning. She smiled when the courtiers bowed. She kissed her child's forehead and played her part so perfectly that the conspirators doubted their own memories, because in the end there was no proof. The paper was gone. The ink was smoke. The story dissolved into rumor. You can see her now, sitting alone in her chamber, the dawn light spreading across her face. The candle is still burning beside her, its flame steady and tall. On the table lies the silver box, empty. She touches it once, almost tenderly, and says, "Some lies die easier than truth." Outside, the bells begin to ring again. Another wedding somewhere, another contract written in someone else's blood. She closes her eyes and breathes in the scent of wax and ash, her pulse slowing, the air around her softening. She's not free yet, not truly, but she's learned how to make history doubt itself. And for a queen, that's the closest thing to victory. You hear the sound before you see the light. Soft lute music drifting from the far end of the palace, slow and wistful, as though time itself were learning to hum. It's evening again, that strange hour between gold and blue, when candle flames tremble and even the servants speak quietly. She sits by the window watching the sky turn from lilac to ink. There's peace in her face tonight. Not the peace of contentment, but the kind that grows in the cracks of resignation. This is the time when love arrived too late. You walk closer, quietly, as if not to disturb the fragile thread that holds her upright. Her son is older now, strong and bright, a living emblem of reconciliation. The kingdom whispers that fortune has returned, that the Queen's prayers have been answered. But they don't see her eyes, how tired they are, how she looks at the world as though it's already something she's remembering. Years have passed since her first letter, her first loss, her first ship. The mirror no longer lies kindly, but the way she carries herself, that quiet, unyielding dignity, is more beautiful than youth ever was. And that's when he arrives. Not the king, not the man who owns her crown, but another. A widowed duke, a scholar, a man who's known her for years as a formal acquaintance, too cautious ever to linger, too respectful ever to intrude. But something in the air has changed. Maybe it's age, maybe it's exhaustion, maybe it's the simple truth that no one expects her to need love anymore. and that makes it safe to feel it. He brings her a book, poetry of course, and they sit by the fire while he reads. His voice is low, patient, deliberate. He pauses often, giving her room to breathe between verses. She listens, not as a queen, but as a woman who remembers what words once felt like. When he finishes, there's silence. She smiles faintly and says, "I used to think poetry was for girls who believed in promises." He answers, "It's for those who survived them." The fire crackles. The guards outside change posts. Somewhere in the distance, church bells mark the hour, a dull reminder of curfews and decorum. She knows nothing can come of this. The court would destroy them both. The church would write a sermon before breakfast, but she's long past the age of illusions. She doesn't need forever. She just needs one evening of truth. Historians still argue about the late letters found among her effects. Fragments of correspondence written in an unfamiliar hand, signed only L. Some call them fabrications, written by later romantics. Others insist they're genuine. The handwriting matches a certain duke's archive, they say, though the letters themselves are oddly restrained. Not passionate, but reflective. Two people who had already lost everything, speaking gently to keep from breaking what little was left. In one of them, the writer says, "You are the only silence I ever wanted to hear." And in her reply, "I am tired of being remembered for the wrong reasons." The rest are missing, burned perhaps, or buried with her. You can picture them, those secret meetings in candlelit rooms where the air smelled faintly of rain and lemon wax. No promises, no vows, just the quiet companionship of two souls who arrived at love like travellers who missed their ship and decided to walk the rest of the way together. One quirky historical note: the Empress Josephine, long after Napoleon divorced her, kept his letters locked in a box and read them until her death. She once told a maid, "He was terrible to me, but love has no memory." Historians still argue whether she meant forgiveness or madness. Our queen doesn't forgive easily. She doesn't believe in miracles, but she believes in moments. So when he reaches for her hand, slowly, cautiously, she lets him hold it. Just that. Nothing more. The gesture feels almost religious in its restraint. For once, she doesn't feel like a relic of power or a pawn in politics. She feels human, small, alive. When he leaves, she doesn't watch him go. She sits still, hands folded in her lap, and listens to the echo of his footsteps fade down the corridor. The fire burns lower, the clock ticks. She's not foolish enough to think it can last, but she's wise enough not to regret it. Later that night, she writes one line in her diary. Not to him, not even to herself, but to whoever might someday read these pages and wonder who she really was beneath the crown. "I was loved once. That will have to be enough." Historians still argue whether that sentence is hers or an archivist's addition. The ink is faded, the paper brittle, but the emotion is unmistakable. That quiet, final grace of someone who found warmth just long enough to remember what it felt like. She dies many years later, peacefully, in her sleep. Her son becomes king. Her name is woven into songs and court legends. They call her the wise queen, the peacemaker, the gentle heart. None of them know about the letters, or the late-night conversations, or the poems half-whispered beside dying embers. But you know, and that's enough. Because love, even when it comes too late, still changes everything it touches. The air in her chamber smells of ink and beeswax and rain. The window is open just wide enough for the sound of the garden to slip through. The hush of leaves, the far-off splash of a fountain, the steady rhythmic fall of water on stone. She's older now, a little bent, a little slower, but sharper than ever. Her hair has thinned to threads of silver, her face lined not by vanity but by memory. And tonight she writes. Not letters this time, not pleas, not orders. She's writing herself, her thoughts, her reflections, her unspoken truths. This is the age of the locked diaries, the hidden archives of queens who learned that history would never tell their story properly, so they wrote it themselves in secret, to no one but time. You can hear the faint scratch of her quill on parchment, the soft exhale of concentration. The candle beside her leans low, pooling wax across the table like slow honey. The words flow in both languages now, her native tongue and her adopted one, switching between them when one feels too small to hold what she needs to say. They called me gentle because I learned to speak softly. They called me wise because I learned when to stay silent. She pauses, dips the pen again. They said my patience was grace. It was survival. There are hundreds of pages already, some written neatly, some furiously, some barely legible through water stains. The entries aren't dated. She never bothers to anchor her thoughts in time. The palace already does enough of that for her. Instead, she writes as if all her years are happening at once. She writes about her first night in the foreign land, about the sea and the portrait and the silence, about the child who carries her name but not her voice, about the man who read poetry to her long after she stopped believing in it. Historians still argue whether her diaries ever truly existed. The legend says they were discovered generations later in a false wall behind the chapel. Others say they were burned the day after her death by a zealous priest to protect her reputation. If they did survive, no one has ever read them whole. Fragments surface now and then. Single torn pages auctioned as curiosities, quoted out of context in academic footnotes, half-deciphered phrases about solitude and endurance. One quirky fact: the British Museum houses a scrap of parchment said to be from a queen's personal diary. The only complete sentence reads, "To be beloved is to vanish politely." No one knows who wrote it, but scholars like to pretend they do. You lean closer to her now, watching as she signs the bottom of a page, not with her title, but with her childhood name, the one no one's called her in decades. She underlines it once, hard enough to tear the paper slightly. The candle flickers. The sound of the fountain outside shifts, softer now like applause. She smiles faintly. "They will say I was devout," she murmurs. "They will say I was patient. They will say I was quiet, and they will be right, just not for the reasons they think." She opens a drawer and pulls out a small iron key, thin, delicate, worn from years of turning. She fits it into the lock of the wooden chest beside her writing desk. Inside are bundles of letters, portraits and trinkets, the locket, the pressed violet, the folded poem. She lays the diary on top, closes the lid, and turns the key once, twice, until the latch clicks. Then she hides the key, not under the pillow or the rug. Too obvious. She slips it into the seam of the velvet curtain beside her window, a place no one will ever think to look. Historians still argue about what the final entry said. Some claim it was a confession, others call it a farewell. But a few, the ones who read the surviving fragments most closely, think it wasn't an ending at all. They say she wrote a single, unfinished line. "The story isn't over, it just forgot my name." Outside, the moon is high now, spilling light across the floorboards. The Queen leans back in her chair, the quill still in her hand, her eyelids heavy. She looks toward the window where the garden glows faintly in silver. For once, she doesn't think of history or politics or even love. She just listens, to the fountain, to the quiet, to the soft murmur of her own breathing. In the morning, She'll wake and be queen again. She'll nod at ministers, smile at courtiers, hold her son's hand as he prepares to rule. But tonight, she's just herself, a woman with ink-stained fingers, a secret chest, and 1,000 unsent words. You can almost hear her whisper to the empty room, "At least I got to write it down." And that, somehow, feels like victory. The room smells faintly of old paper and lavender oil, the scent of endings that have learned how to linger. Morning light filters through gauze curtains, spilling across her writing desk, turning the edges of her parchment to gold. The queen is awake before the servants. She sits in silence, her hands folded loosely in her lap, her gaze fixed on nothing and everything. Today is her birthday. No one will mention it aloud. The years have made her smaller, quieter, but not diminished. She's the kind of old that glows from within, the kind that has seen enough to stop pretending shock. This is the era of revision, on when stories start to twist into legends, and the woman who lived them begins to recognize herself in rumor. Outside her door, the courtiers whisper new versions of her. She's the merciful queen, the saint of the second chance, the mother of nations. She has become adjectives instead of a person. She hears the words through the walls and thinks, "They never knew me, and yet they speak as if I'm a monument they helped build." You can almost feel her restraint, that delicate, knife-edged balance between vanity and disgust. She stands and walks to her mirror, the same one she's had since her youth. The glass is slightly warped now, the silvering at the edges peeling away. Her reflection wavers, as though the world can't decide which version of her to remember. For a long time, she simply looks. Historians still argue whether her saintly reputation was the result of her piety or her politics. Some claim her devotion was genuine, others say it was an act of self-defense, a performance of meekness that protected her from those who would have written her into villainy. She never bothered to correct them. When you've lived inside rumor long enough, it begins to wear like a second skin. You follow her through the morning, through the soft corridors where her slippers make no sound, through the chapel where candles burn down to the wick. The servants bow. The guards nod. Everyone smiles the way one smiles at a relic. She kneels briefly at the altar, not to pray but to rest. Her joints ache, but she hides it well. Her silence has become her armor, her invisibility, her victory. Later, in her private sitting room, her confessor arrives. He's young, younger than her son even, with soft eyes and an uncertain faith. He bows low, clutching a leather-bound Bible. "Your Majesty," he says, "may I read the homily prepared for your feast day?" She gestures for him to continue. He reads slowly, reverently, describing her unwavering faith, her gentle influence on the realm, her divine endurance. Each word lands like a tiny weight on her chest. When he finishes, he waits for approval. She smiles kindly and says, "It's beautiful." Then after a pause, "And entirely wrong?" He blinks, startled. "Majesty, you describe patience as a virtue," she says softly. "But patience was only my disguise. He doesn't understand. He isn't meant to." One quirky fact: when Catherine Parr, Henry VIII's last wife, outlived her husband, she published a devotional book titled Lamentations of a Sinner. Scholars argue she used religion as camouflage to write what she really thought about surviving tyranny. The dedication reads like repentance. The subtext reads like triumph. Our Queen has learned the same trick. She gestures toward the Bible in his hands. Tell them to read what they want. They'll only hear themselves anyway. When he leaves, she turns back to her desk. There's a fresh sheet of paper waiting. She writes one sentence at the top in careful, slow strokes. The truth is not a danger. It is simply inconvenient. Then she sets down her quill and laughs softly. It's the first genuine laugh you've heard from her in years. Outside, the courtyard is filling with preparations for the celebration she didn't ask for. Musicians tuning their lutes, bakers carrying trays of sugared fruit, courtiers rehearsing toasts. She can already imagine the speeches, the endless praise, the anecdotes polished into parables. None of them will mention how lonely she was, how cunning, how much she sacrificed in silence. None of them will say that she loved once, quietly, and that it was enough. She stands by the window again, watching her people gather below. They look so small from up here, bright specks of colour moving through the grey courtyard, like jewels scattered on stone. And for the first time, she feels something close to peace. It isn't forgiveness, it isn't redemption, it's acceptance, the rarest kind. Historians still argue what her final years were like. Some say she turned entirely to faith, others that she advised her son in secret. One legend insists she kept a diary until the very end, each entry beginning with the same line, "Today they remembered me wrongly." You like to think that's true, because in the end, she's no longer trying to be remembered correctly. She just wants to be remembered at all. As evening falls, she sits in the candlelight, her reflection trembling in the window pane, half woman, half myth. She whispers, not to God, not to history, but to herself. Let them write their stories. I have already written mine. Outside, the bells ring again. Not for weddings, not for war, just because it's the hour. And as the sound fades, you realize something gentle, something final. She no longer lives in history. She lives in peace. You open a drawer and find a folded letter the colour of moth wings, fragile, numbered in a clerk's hand, and smudged with salt that could be ink or could be tears. The name on the seal makes your chest tighten. Catherine. Not the legend, not the portrait, but a woman who wrote in a small, firm hand and expected nothing to be returned. You hold the paper like contraband. This is the chapter where Catherine's tears stain the archives, the files and calendars, where policy meets private grief. You follow a royal bride who kept writing when every courier might be an enemy, who recorded her loneliness in margins that make historians sigh. Her letters are stubborn witnesses, petitions, prayers, household notes to her daughter, and a last famous plea written when her health and fortune were failing. Those closing lines, an invitation to mercy and a request for the care of her child, have been read aloud for centuries. Historians still argue whether these letters are straightforward expressions of heartbreak or finely tuned instruments of diplomacy. Was the tenderness genuine sorrow or a rhetorical device meant to influence powerful relatives and foreign courts? The answer is probably both, because people are both sentimental and strategic at once. You trace the pages and read the ordinary things she wrote. Corrections to household accounts, an oblique scolding of a steward, a note about the weather back home. There's a shopping list practicality rubbing shoulders with petitions for dignified treatment. It's shockingly modern. Imagine a queen muttering, "Buy sugar," and try to remember my name. Those small papers travelled on tired horses across cold bridges, sometimes into bureaucratic dead ends. A mainstream fact to pin down. Many of Catherine's letters survive in calendars of state papers and collections across England and Spain. Scholars still use these as primary sources when reconstructing Tudor diplomacy and domestic life. The manuscripts are often fragmentary, but their persistence gives us a direct line to a woman otherwise filtered through portrait and policy. There's a quirky detail you'll enjoy. Some of her later missives are written in a hand so shaky that archivists who handled them centuries later joked, quietly, with gloves on, that she was practicing a new script. It's a morbid little joke, but it humanizes the unreadable, a powerful woman reduced to a trembling pen. That tiny touch of dry humor is the thing historians pass between marginal notes. Her final letters are the ones that wedge under your ribs. The most famous was written at Kimbolton Castle, where she lay ill. In it, she forgives Henry, prays for his soul, and entrusts their daughter Mary to him. The letter's survival has shaped her memory, no longer only a discarded queen in a portrait, but someone who wrote with astonishing dignity in her last hours. Historians still argue about whether later copyists and clerks softened or edited her phrasing when transcribing those last pages. Scribes sometimes clean up texts for readability. Marginal notes get lost, ink blots erase meaning. Archival work is literary detective work. Find a blot and you might find a motive. You picture the scene, a small table, a single candle, wind at the casement, and a woman folding her life into lines of ink. Letters are intimate in a way that portraits never can be. Portraits freeze a carefully arranged face. Letters keep the voice, the pauses, the smudges, the sudden bursts of anger or tenderness. Remember how paintings promised husbands and diplomacy? Letters answered those painted lies with messy, living truths. Some fringe theories whisper that officials intercepted and sometimes altered correspondence to suit policy, covering inconvenient confessions with diplomatic language. You roll your eyes tenderly, because governments edit the record all the time, but the idea that a dying woman's words were systematically censored still feels petty, even for courtly standards. Historians still argue whether any organized suppression of her letters took place, or whether the gaps are simply the sad arithmetic of lost documents. The material reality of grief surprises you. An archive is a kind of reliquary, brittle leaves, pigeonholed folders, the faint dust scent of old ink. You run a finger along a page, and your touch is the only human warmth it's had in centuries. Those tiny smudges, dark circles where tears once sat, are not metaphor. They are physical traces of someone feeling things in private and leaving them where future strangers might find them. And yes, historians can be absurdly dramatic. They read an awkward phrase and compose careers around it. Light joke 1. Historians are the original binge watchers. They devour correspondence like episodes and then argue about the finale. 2. Archival gloves are the medieval equivalent of armor, stylish, fragile, and slightly theatrical. 3. If a Queen's letter went viral, Tudor history might have had fewer executions and more group therapy. The letters also forged myths. A private scrawl about loneliness becomes a circulating quotation about martyrdom. A shopping note becomes an emblem of virtue. The archive is both tomb and theatre. Yet in the theatre you can still hear small, honest details, the scent of lavender sachets, the rustle of a dress, the low hum of a thin fire in a sparsely heated chamber. Those details make her real in ways that statues never will. You close the moth paper gently and put it back. The drawer slides shut with a soft click, and you realize the archive will breathe long after you switch off the bedside light. Her letters outlasted the pageantry that tried to define her. They turned a painted face into a voice. Those ink stains are stubborn proof that someone felt, loudly and quietly, in the midst of treaties and portraits. If you ever find yourself awake at night fan-humming, imagine those folded letters in your hands. They are small rebellions, private lines that refuse to be wholly owned by history. They ask nothing grand, only to be read as a woman, not a title. You close the drawer and whisper to the empty room, "Thank you." The papers rustle, as if in response. The moon tonight looks like a coin someone has rubbed half smooth, dull on one edge, gleaming on the other. Its light slips through the high windows of the library and gathers around her like a shawl. She moves among the shelves slowly, her candle leaving a trembling trail of gold behind her. Every surface smells faintly of parchment and dust and beeswax. Somewhere, beyond the closed doors, a clock is ticking, the heartbeat of a house that has learned to outlive its people. This is the hour of quiet revision, when queens, widows, and ghosts sit with the history written about them and decide, finally, what they will allow to remain true. She knows they are writing about her again. She can feel it in the way the courtiers glance when she passes, a flicker of reverence laced with the hunger of gossip. Chroniclers are assembling their stories, scholars sharpening their quills. She is being flattened into legend, like a flower pressed between pages. So she reads. On the desk before her lies a bound manuscript, the life and virtues of Her Majesty the Queen. Her son's ministers have had it prepared as propaganda, the perfect tale of the perfect woman who served God, king, and country with unwavering obedience. She runs her finger over the page, the skin of her hands translucent now, the veins showing like blue ink beneath. The text glows faintly in the candlelight. She was patient, pious, and most of all, content in her station. Content. She almost laughs. You can feel the heat rising in her. Not rage exactly, but the kind of tired defiance that comes from years of being politely erased. She picks up a quill. The ink glistens. She begins to write in the margins. Patience is not contentment. Obedience is not peace. And virtue, without choice, is only survival. Historians will never see these notes. The book will remain locked in her private chamber, where time will yellow it into legend. But for tonight, she edits herself. This act, small, silent, invisible, is her rebellion. A mainstream historical fact. Many royal women commissioned their own biographies or devotional lives, often edited by confessors or poets. Queen Marguerite of Navarre wrote the Heptameron in secret. Queen Christina of Sweden penned manifestos disguised as theology. They all understood the same truth, that if they did not write themselves, men would write them instead. Our queen joins their ranks, though she doesn't call it authorship. She calls it correction. The quill scratches across the parchment. You can hear the rhythm of her pulse in the motion. Steady, patient, determined. She crosses out the words graceful silence and replaces them with necessary silence. She adds a sentence of her own. Silence is only golden when you're allowed to speak again. The candle flickers, and for a moment, her reflection shivers in the window glass. Not the old queen, but the girl who once stood on a ship deck, trembling before an unknown shore. She wonders what that girl would think of this woman. Older, unbowed, rewriting her story while the world sleeps. Historians still argue about how much of any queen's legacy belonged to her, and how much to her scribes. Some say their voices are lost entirely. Others insist they linger between the lines like the faint echo of ink that seeps through paper. The truth, as always, is somewhere in between. Survival disguised as footnote. One quirky fact, when Elizabeth of Falworth edited her own speeches, she used to cross out words with tiny stars instead of lines, as if decorating the act of defiance. Some archivists think she did it to distract readers from the censorship. Others say she just liked how it looked. Either way, the gesture was a signature, rebellion made elegant. Our queen finishes the last page and leans back. The candle has nearly burned itself out. She flips through the book, one final time, reading her own annotations. The margins are full now, her voice threading through the official story like a heartbeat under silk. She closes the cover. The sound echoes softly like a sigh. Then she takes a small knife, the kind used for trimming quills, and carefully removes the final page. On it is the official ending written by her scribes. She passed from this world as she lived in it, obedient, serene, and beloved. She stares at it for a long moment. Then she feeds it to the candle flame. The parchment curls, blackens, and collapses into ash. The Queen watches it burn, her face calm, her eyes bright. "That's better," she whispers. The ash drifts upward and vanishes into the night. She doesn't replace the page. She doesn't need to. The story will end whether she permits it or not, but at least now it ends on her terms, with an omission, not a lie. Historians still argue whether the missing final page of the life and virtues of Her Majesty was lost or destroyed. Some say fire, some say politics, a few even suspect the Queen herself. The absence has become its own kind of myth, a silence that refuses to explain itself. And maybe that's the point. As dawn creeps in, pale and cold, she closes her eyes for a moment. The quill rolls from her fingers and lands silently on the table. Outside, the bells begin again, always the bells, tolling the hour in slow, deliberate rhythm. You can almost hear her whisper, not with regret, but with relief. "Let them guess what I meant." And in that whisper, you realize how the Queen has finally learned the greatest form of power available to any woman history misremembers. Ambiguity. Rain again. Soft, mist-like, the kind that doesn't fall so much as drift, blurring the edges of the world. The palace gardens glisten with it, the marble paths shining pale under a silver sky. You follow her there, the Queen, now old enough that the world bows more out of habit than duty. This is the season of ghosts, when memory becomes company, and the people who once filled her life return not in flesh, but in fragments, a scent, a sound, a shadow across the window pane. She walks slowly through the damp air, the scent of wet earth rising like incense. Her steps are careful, deliberate, though her eyes still hold that steady light. In one hand, she carries a small umbrella of black silk, in the other, a letter sealed in wax. One she'll never send. The gardeners bow as she passes, their hands muddy, their faces lined with reverence and pity. They've heard the stories, everyone has, the patient queen, the wise widow, the silent saint. But the woman walking among the roses is no saint. She is simply tired of being translated. Historians still argue whether she spent her final years in contentment or quiet rebellion. Some accounts paint her as devout, absorbed in charity and prayer. Others describe her as restless, even subversive, keeping secret correspondences with foreign scholars, funding translations of forbidden books. The truth, as always, lives somewhere in the quiet middle. The garden's paths twist like memory. Every corner leads to something familiar. The fountain where she once read poetry, the bench where she first held her son as a newborn, the wall where she used to feed birds that no longer come. It's here she speaks aloud to no one. "They think I forgot everything," she says softly, "but I remember too much." Her voice is almost swallowed by the rain. You walk beside her, the sound of water muffling your footsteps. She stops beside a statue, one of the old queens, carved long before her time. The marble face is smooth, unreadable, hands clasped in eternal piety. She reaches out, touches the statue's arm and laughs, a soft, weary laugh. "They even made her pray forever," she murmurs. "Imagine such cruelty." Then quieter. "If I am carved, let them make me laugh instead." There's something defiant in that wish. something human. She sits down on the stone bench beside the fountain. The letter in her hand is damp now, the wax seal glistening dark red. She doesn't open it. She doesn't need to. She knows every word. To whoever inherits my silence, it begins. You will not remember my voice, but you will hear it anyway. It will live in the margins, in the pauses between bells, in the places where the historians got lazy. She smiles faintly. She wrote it years ago when her hand was steadier, when she still thought legacy was a conversation she could control. Now she knows better. Legacy is a rumour with a long memory. One quirky fact: when Queen Christina of Sweden abdicated her throne in 1654, she left behind a library catalogue with cryptic marginal notes that scholars still can't fully decipher. Some are mundane, some philosophical, some suspiciously playful. One line simply reads, "They will misunderstand me anyway." It could have been written by this queen, too. The rain grows heavier. You can smell the minerals in it, the dampness of the carved stone. She looks up toward the palace, those endless windows, each framing a story that used to belong to her. Inside, her son rules now. He listens to her advice out of respect, not necessity. Her court bows out of love, not fear. It should be enough. It isn't. She feels no bitterness, just a strange, quiet amusement. "They have finally made me harmless," she says. "It only took a lifetime." You think she might cry then, but she doesn't. Queens learn early that tears have too much currency to spend freely. She unfolds the letter. The ink has bled slightly, the words blurred, but not erased. She reads one line aloud: "I forgive them for making me holy." Then with slow precision she tears the letter in half. The sound is shockingly loud in the rain. A rip, a declaration, a release. She drops the pieces into the fountain where they float briefly before dissolving into paper pulp. The water carries them away, tiny grey ghosts spinning in circles. Historians still argue whether she ever destroyed her writings before death. Some claim her confessor burned them by her order. Others insist she left them hidden behind the chapel wall. Either way, what remains of her voice today comes from fragments, the sort of sentences that seem to hum even in silence. You watch her sit there, the rain tracing lines across her cheeks. Not tears, rain. The fountain's surface ripples, erasing her reflection again and again. For a long time she just listens. To the water, to the faint bells from the cathedral, to the silence between them. "I have been many things," she says at last. "A wife, a ghost, a rumour, a name, but never quite a person." She turns her face toward the grey sky, eyes half closed, and adds, with something like wonder, "Perhaps that is the price of being remembered at all." The rain eases, the world holds still, the garden smells of green and stone and endings. When she rises, her joints creak like old wood. She doesn't look back at the fountain. She doesn't need to, because the past, her past, finally feels smaller than the space she occupies now. And as she walks back toward the palace, the last of the paper in the water dissolves into nothing. Ink and rainwater blending into the same shade of grey. The first frost arrives before the bells do. It creeps in overnight, tracing every window pane with lace, turning the garden paths white. When the servants throw open the shutters in the morning, the air inside the palace sighs as though it's bracing itself. You find her at her desk again, wrapped in a shawl of pale wool, her breath faintly visible in the chill. The fire in the hearth burns low, more ember than flame. She isn't writing this time, she's sorting. Neat stacks of papers, letters, sketches, lists. Each one folded, refolded and tied with thin ribbons of blue and white. Her handwriting has grown smaller, tighter, as if she's afraid of wasting space. This is the season of cataloguing, when a life becomes inventory. She murmurs softly as she works. "This one goes to the archives," she says, placing a sealed envelope on the left. "This one to the chapel, and this one—" She pauses, holding up a faded scrap of parchment. "This one goes nowhere at all." It's a letter she never finished. The handwriting stops mid-sentence, the ink splattered where her pen must have slipped. You can see the faintest trace of a word, "believe," before the line trails off into nothing. She smiles faintly. "I suppose that one's honest," she says. The sound of distant bells rolls through the hallways. 3 long tolls, 1 short. She counts them without thinking. It's the rhythm of her days now, the bells, the fire, the sound of her own pulse when the world is quiet. Outside, the frost glitters like powdered glass. The bare branches of the orchard stretch against the grey sky. The land looks as if it's holding its breath. Historians still argue whether she knew she was dying. Some say her letters grew suddenly tender, her tone softened, her instructions became meticulous. Others insist she was lucid and calm until the end, too disciplined to admit fear. Maybe both are true. Maybe she just wanted everything in its place. She opens the top drawer of her desk. Inside a small object, a locket, the same one, now dulled with age, a broken seal, a ribbon embroidered with her family crest, a dried violet pressed between glass. Each one carries a weight only she remembers. One quirky fact, in certain royal households it was tradition to burn the possessions of a deceased queen to prevent relic collectors from profiting off her life. Even her hairbrushes, her gowns, her letters, all ash. But she, ever contrary, has already given instructions otherwise. "Let them keep everything," she told her son. "Let them pick through it. Let them guess who I was." She knows that control, in the end, is impossible, but interpretation, that she can still influence. So she begins labeling. Her quill scratches softly. For the historians, beware of adjectives. For the poets, exaggerate nothing. I've done that already by living. For the women, you owe them nothing, not even patience. She pauses, dips her quill again, and adds one final note at the bottom of the page. For whoever finds this, remember that silence is a language too. The ink dries unevenly. You can feel the stillness of the room thickening, the kind that arrives before snow. A servant knocks, brings her a cup of hot milk with honey. She thanks him softly, then waits until the door closes before pouring half of it into the fire. The hiss makes her smile. "An offering," she whispers, "to whatever god bothers to listen now." Historians still argue about her religion, whether her late-life piety was devotion or diplomacy. The church claimed her as a saint, the scholars called her a skeptic. Neither, perhaps, were wrong. She'd spent too many years negotiating with heaven to believe in simple categories. The frost outside deepens. A raven lands on the balcony rail, its feathers black and wet. It cocks its head, watching her. She looks up from her desk and says, "You again?" Yes, you remember him, the same bird that appeared years ago when her first husband died. A myth the servants whisper about, the queen's familiar, her omen, her witness. She tears a scrap from a blank page and writes something small, quick, almost invisible. Then she folds it once and places it on the windowsill beside the raven. The bird studies her, then takes the paper in its beak and flies into the fog. No one ever learns what she wrote. One courtier later claims to have found a fragment of that note in the snow outside the chapel, the ink nearly erased. Only 2 words survived. Tell nothing. Perhaps that was her final command to the world. Night falls early. The servants light candles, their flames flicker along the walls like thin ghosts. The Queen rests in her chair, the shawl pulled tight, her head tilted slightly back. Her eyes are open, fixed on the ceiling beams. You stand beside her, listening to the small sounds, the crack of the fire, the faint sigh of the wind through the window. After a while she speaks, barely audible. Do you hear it? You listen. Nothing. The world turning, she says. It keeps doing that no matter how tired we are. Her voice trails off, and for a moment you think she's drifted to sleep. Then she adds, almost playfully, I hope it forgets me soon. I've been heavy on its mind long enough. And for the first time in her long, complicated life, she laughs. Not the polite, silken sound of court laughter, but something rough and real. The laugh of someone who's finally stopped performing. You want to hold on to that sound forever, but it fades like breath on glass. The candle burns lower. The frost climbs higher on the windows. The bells toll again. And she goes on writing, one last note, her handwriting growing smaller, steadier, softer, until the ink thins to silence. History can have me, but not yet. Morning breaks pale and almost soundless, as if afraid to disturb her. The palace moves slowly, deliberately. Even the servants whisper as they pass through the halls. The frost hasn't melted yet. It glitters on the windows, a thin film of light, fragile as breath on glass. Her chamber door stands ajar. Inside, the fire has gone out. The smell of beeswax and ink still hangs in the air, mixed with something faint and metallic, the trace of extinguished flame. She sits in her chair exactly where you left her, wrapped in her shawl, hands folded loosely in her lap. For a moment, she looks like she might speak. Her mouth curved in a half-smile, her gaze turned toward the window, where the sky is the colour of unpolished silver. But she won't. This is the morning after a queen stops breathing, and the world, remarkably, continues. Outside, bells toll again, but this time the sound is different, lower, slower, each note drawn out like a thought no one wants to finish. The courtiers gather, their shoes clicking on the marble floor, their voices hushed. She went peacefully, someone says, in her sleep. Like a saint, adds another. You know better. She didn't die like a saint. She died like a scholar finishing a thought, mid-sentence, pen still in hand. Historians still argue whether her final hours were serene or deliberate. The records disagree. One says she prayed until the end. Another says she refused confession, whispering instead, I have already told my story. Whatever the truth, her last act was not surrender, it was authorship. They come to prepare her body by the priest, the attendants, the chambermaids. The priest mumbles verses about humility. The chambermaids, who have loved her longest, cry silently while they undo her hair. And then, as one of them lifts the shawl from her shoulders, a folded paper slips from the folds and drifts to the floor. A servant picks it up carefully, afraid to look. But the priest nods. Read it. The maid opens it. The ink is fresh, still dark, as if it was written just before she died. Only 3 sentences. Do not let them close my mouth. The world will try to finish my story without my permission. Leave it open so I can laugh again when they get it wrong. The maid presses the paper to her chest, trembling. The priest clears his throat and mutters that such words are metaphorical. The servants know better. That afternoon, her body is carried to the chapel. Candles line the aisle, so many their smoke stains the ceiling black. Her son follows behind, head bowed, crown glinting in the light. The people outside kneel as the bells ring and the cortege passes. She would have hated it. All this solemn choreography, all this heavy music pretending to understand her life. One quirky fact. Some queens' funerals lasted days, their bodies displayed behind gauze screens so the people could admire them one final time. But when the attendants remove the veil from her face, they find something unusual. She is smiling. It unnerves them. Queens are supposed to look serene in death, not amused. Historians still argue whether the smile was natural or a trick of rigor mortis. One chronicler calls it the last vanity of a vain woman. Another insists it was the look of forgiveness. Neither is correct. It was satisfaction. She'd already rewritten herself so completely that not even death could find the right ending. You stand at the edge of the chapel as the priest speaks the final rites. The air is thick with incense and whispers. Every candle trembles slightly in the draught. As the choir begins to sing, a single raven, the same one, you're sure, lands on the chapel roof. It taps its beak once against the stained glass, hard enough to echo. The priest flinches. The courtiers cross themselves. The maid looks up and smiles. When the ceremony ends, the coffin is carried down into the crypt. Stone walls, cold air, the sound of boots on hollow steps. They place her beside her husband, the king who once forgot to know her, though you suspect she would have preferred to rest elsewhere. The priest recites her titles, each one polished into marble: Duchess, Queen, Regent, Mother, Patroness. Then finally, the Blessed Widow. You hear her laughter echo faintly, like a breeze moving through old curtains. The tomb is sealed. Above ground, life stirs again. Ministers return to work. Courtiers rehearse new allegiances. The chroniclers sharpen their pens. Already they are arguing over her legacy. The words pious and patient tossed back and forth like coins. Her son decrees that her writings be preserved. Not all survive. Some are lost. Others edited for clarity. But a few remain untouched. Her notes in the margins, her diary pages, the letter to whoever inherits my silence. And those, more than any monument, are what outlive her. You leave the chapel and step into the cold afternoon. The frost has begun to melt, turning the garden paths slick and shining. The air smells clean, almost new. Somewhere, faint but unmistakable, you hear a raven call. You follow the sound toward the fountain, where the water still runs, soft and constant. The reflection there is only sky, grey, endless, indifferent. But if you listen long enough, you can almost hear her voice woven through the sound of the falling water. "They will remember me wrongly," she says. "But they will remember me." And maybe that, after all, is enough. You learn, slowly and almost by accident, that power smells faintly of lavender and ink. It doesn't roar, it whispers, it doesn't brandish a sword, it arranges a dinner. The rooms where women like you move quietly are full of soft conspiracies: a favoured needleworker who tailors a robe to flatter the right cousin, a book gifted to the Chancellor with a penciled note folded inside, a discreet compliment paid to a diplomat that softens his tone for a week. This is the perfume of power, influence worn like an amulet, exchanged in small courtesies, accumulated in margins. You have practiced the art of small things for years. At first, it was survival. Smile at the right moment, laugh at the approved joke, praise the hunting dogs even if you hate dogs. Later, it becomes strategy. A queen who cannot command an army learns to command attention. She gathers people whose opinions matter and gives them the one thing courtiers crave most: notice. She remembers names, she remembers birthdays, she remembers which minister's wife reads Horace aloud on Sundays. In a court of thunderous men, remembering is a kind of thunderbolt. One mainstream historical fact settles into your mind like a stone in a river. Many royal consorts, women who never held formal office, exercised real influence through patronage, conversation, and household management. Think of Catherine de' Medici, who, whether by culinary legend or careful diplomacy, hosted receptions and banquets that set fashions and smoothed fragile alliances. Or look at Eleanor of Aquitaine, who manoeuvred more kings by marriage and counsel than many a general ever did. Historians still argue whether these acts were mere ornamentation or a subtle recharting of policy. The evidence is dotted and partisan, but the pattern is undeniable. You learn to make soup like a minister makes a law. Not literally. Your cooks keep the ladles. But you learn that a well-timed feast does what proclamations cannot. It humanizes. It lets a duke who's been arrogant to your face remember that you once wept for the same rainstorm his child wept for. It allows a foreign ambassador to taste your bread and decide for a small, private reason that you are not the enemy his dispatches insist you to be. Influence becomes culinary diplomacy. Joke 1, if diplomacy were a recipe, most treaties would call for 2 cups of flattery, a pinch of bribery, and 1 stubborn queen diced. You begin to hold salons, discreet literary evenings where poets read, musicians play, and conversation steers toward ideas rather than gossip. At first, these are invitations to comfort yourself with books. Later, they are laboratories where alliances are tested. A scholar admires your argument about river tolls. A foreign envoy overhears and repeats it favorably to his master. A small policy change follows in quiet days. The orchestra plays, ministers listen, the kingdom moves. Small things again. A quirky thing you savor. Queens sometimes used fashion as policy. A collar worn to a particular audience, a colour chosen to honour a visiting envoy, a jewel loaned to seal a promise. These are tiny broadcasts. When you wear the embroidered blue sash of a distant duchy, the ambassador will notice, perhaps feel flattered enough to moderate his stance. When you quietly commission a portrait, showing you with a map placed just so, future historians will wonder whether the map was vanity or a signal about borders. Historians still argue whether certain wardrobe choices were intentional policy or mere taste. Either way, dresses make better gossip than treaties. You invent practices to bend the impossible into the plausible. You meet with clerics to revise how prayers are said in the chapel, ensuring the right men hear you mention mercy in a way that influences policy toward the poor. You summon a musician who plays a melancholy tune that loosens the tongue of a sullen minister, who then confesses an embezzlement. On a confession you convert into leverage, not justice. Influence tastes like roasted figs and sounds like a lute in the corridor. Sometimes your influence is protective rather than offensive. You find your son's tutor guilty of cruelty and quietly appoint another who will teach him empathy rather than arrogance. You restore a dismissed physician who, though political, knows how to cure ordinary people. The populace notices and tells stories that change the court's mood. Little repairs build reputations, reputations build trust. Trust yields latitude to do more. It is slow work, like knitting a scarf while the cold world waits. But it is work that warms. You discover an essential paradox. The more invisible you are forced to be, the more conspicuous your movements must become to matter. If you cannot issue proclamations, you must plant opinions. If you cannot sit at the council's table, you must put ideas in the right mouths. Your influence becomes a shadow economy. Favors exchanged, marriages suggested, books recommended. You begin to keep a little ledger in your mind, not of money, but of kindnesses and debts. Who owes whom a smile, who needs a position, who remembers a favor owed. It is the only accounting system that matters in a court where titles trump truth. And sometimes influence requires theatre. You orchestrate a staged reconciliation between rivals so that they leave the hall with their egos intact and their swords sheathed. You lend a jewel publicly to your nephew's new wife, and that public act diffuses a rumour about treason. You throw a banquet with no obvious purpose and watch as alliances sew themselves across the tablecloth. Influence, you learn, is often the art of making people believe they acted of their own accord. There are moral compromises. You learn to be strategically cruel when survival requires it, to remove a corrupt steward quietly rather than accuse him publicly and risk a factional war, to arrange a marriage that secures peace though it sacrifices a cousin's happiness. Those choices linger like perfume on your skirts, pleasant for some, suffocating for others. You console yourself with the knowledge that sometimes cruelty is a triage. Fewer suffer when you can prevent war. Still, the conscience keeps notes. Joke 2, you start to imagine your conscience as a very small, very irritating clerk who keeps sending you memos. One evening, you overhear a minister on the verge of a ruinous trade decree. He sees you as nothing more than a courteous relic, but you have already prepared. A book in the right study, a poem in the right hand, a compliment in the right ear. Within days, the decree softens into a regulation that benefits border towns rather than barons. Historians still argue whether such soft power actually changed policy or merely smoothed its edges. Some credit women's salons for averting crises, others shrug and point to coincidence. You know the truth in the marrow, that the soft and small can sometimes redirect the hard and large. You collect allies who are not obvious, a seamstress who has access to the Duchess's private rooms, a steward who remembers every creditor's name, a page who can slip a note into the Chancellor's pocket. These are the real instruments of influence. You reward them with small, meaningful things. A loaf of bread when she is hungry, a safe lodging when he is in danger. The most loyal servants are not necessarily those with grand titles. Often they are the ones who understand the cost of silence. A final, somewhat romantic truth. Influence also becomes a way to be kind in a world that forgot how. When the tip of the winter comes and a seamstress's son falls ill, you quietly arrange for medicine from the royal apothecary. When the baker's oven collapses, you commission a new one from crown funds disguised as a public works project. It costs less than wars and yields more gratitude. Your court remembers you for these things long after treaties are redrawn. Sometimes history forgives what power had to take. You keep a private list scrawled on a scrap of parchment and hidden under the false bottom of a drawer. Who to thank, who to watch, which debts to forgive, which alliances to make. It is the atlas of your influence, a map with no borders. You look at it sometimes at night and feel the strange satisfaction of someone who has finally learned how to steer without steering visibly. And in those private hours, when the candles gutter and your son sleeps and the palace settles into its habitual breath, you allow yourself a quiet, almost wicked thought. The power you wield is invisible, yes, but it is real. It rearranges people's lives as surely as any law. It costs less blood. It demands patience and a good sense of tea. Joke 3. If diplomacy had a smell, it would be equal parts brewed tea and the faintest hint of revenge. Historians still argue about the ethics of such influence, whether it empowers women to save realms or whether it forces them to operate in morally compromised shadows. They write long, earnest footnotes and hold conferences full of polite disagreement. You, meanwhile, keep doing the work, the quiet notes, the dinners, the small mercies. You know history will argue. You are content for now to act. You fold a note, press it with a coin, and slip it into the seam of your sleeve. a thank you to a page who once saved a letter for you. The coin warms your fingers. Outside, the palace bell rings the hour. Inside, a lute begins to play. You stand, straighten your collar, and go back into the room where men think they decide the state. You watch and wait for the right moment to plant a seed, because the perfume of power you've discovered is not the same as the shine of a crown. It is quieter, more practical. It smells faintly of lavender, ink, and the bread you give away on cold mornings. It is how queens who never met their husbands still change the shape of nations, one small kindness at a time. There is a saying that keeps echoing in the palace corridors long after she's gone. A woman who smiles too softly at power must be plotting something. The courtiers laugh when they repeat it, but not too loudly, because they know it's true. This is the age of retribution, though no one dares to call it that aloud. You are older now, but the world around you has grown younger. Reckless, impatient, forgetful of debts. The ministers who once trembled at your patience now take your silence for surrender. They forget that silence is never empty. They should have remembered the margins of your books. They should have remembered that you learned influence like an instrument. They should have remembered that you remember everything. Historians still argue whether the tales that followed were truth or invention. The revenge legends of widowed queens who outlived their kings and quietly rewrote the rules. Some say the stories were moral warnings, cautionary fables about vanity and sin. Others claim they were propaganda invented by men uneasy with the idea of a woman who could wound without lifting a sword. Either way you hear them now are whispered around hearths, traded in markets, half admired, half feared. They call you the smiling queen. They say that those who crossed you found themselves ruined, their fortunes reversed, their secrets exposed, their reputations undone by unseen hands. You never confirm it. You never deny it. Instead, you plant roses. The irony delights you. The garden where you once wept has become the setting of your quiet war. Roses are political creatures. They bloom or wither depending on which hands prune them. And your hands, steady, patient, know how to make thorns do the work of blades. Each noble who once mocked your son's inexperience receives a letter sealed with a rose emblem, a polite invitation to dine. Each minister who whispered against you receives a gift, a bottle of imported wine, a prayer book, a portrait sketch, harmless things. Except that the wine reminds one man of a forbidden debt. The prayer book bears an inscription that uncannily echoes a rumor he thought buried. And the portrait is by a painter who notices everything and speaks too freely. Within a month, factions shift, names disappear from guest lists. A new alliance blooms, loyal to the young king, loyal to his late mother's memory. And you, the quiet architect, smile and serve tea. Historians still argue whether these coincidences were orchestrated or divine justice. They debate the so-called rose letters, the mysterious correspondences discovered decades later in the archives, unsigned, written in a woman's hand, always folded with a dried petal inside. Some scholars insist they were merely coded love notes. Others believe they were the blueprints of a silent coup. The truth, as ever, lives somewhere between perfume and ink. You can almost hear her voice in those letters, calm, witty, laced with warning. History prefers its women patient, one begins. But patience, my dear, is just the most elegant disguise for revenge. She writes without venom. Her tone is almost affectionate, like a mother teaching her child the alphabet of survival. A quirky historical tidbit. In the late 17th century, Queen Christina of Sweden was rumoured to have kept a revenge cabinet, drawers filled with letters, debts, and favours owed. Modern historians suspect it was an ordinary filing system, but the myth persists because it feels right. Every queen needs somewhere to store the memories she's not supposed to have. Our queen's memory is sharper than any blade. She doesn't destroy her enemies outright. She simply introduces consequences. A gossiping lady's husband loses a lucrative post. A treacherous bishop's sermon is mysteriously copied and sent to Rome with an anonymous note pointing out its heresy. A pompous ambassador's courier vanishes with a dispatch that miraculously reappears in your son's study. You never touch a thing, you only nudge. One phrase, one letter, one whisper. And yet in the following months, the court feels your invisible presence like static in the air. Conversations stop when you enter a room. Ministers bow too deeply. The king, your son, smiles but never asks questions. He knows better. Historians still argue about the night of the fire banquet. The evening the chandeliers fell in the great hall, scattering glass like stars. Some claim it was accident, others see omen. What they all agree on is what happened afterward, the dismissal of 6 senior ministers, the sudden promotions of 3 obscure ones, men known for loyalty, not brilliance. You attend none of the meetings, you issue no commands, but when the dust settles, the kingdom finally feels stable. Revenge, you discover, is less about punishment than correction. It's not cruelty, it's symmetry. There's a line in one of your old diaries, faint, almost illegible now. Mercy is a luxury for those who have never been silenced. You don't hate the men who wronged you, you outlasted them. You outgrew them. What you hate is the system that made patience your only weapon. And so you sharpen patience into art. Your last act of influence is invisible. A single clause added to a royal decree, a law ensuring that future queens may hold property in their own right, not merely through their husbands, a small thing, tucked between trade tariffs and border regulations, but it stays. Centuries later, scholars will find your signature in the margins and argue whether it was accident or rebellion. They'll never know. That's the beauty of it. You wander through your garden again. The frost melted now, the roses blooming even in winter. Their scent is faint, bittersweet. You stop to cut one, careful not to draw blood. The gardener bows. Your Majesty, the thorns are sharp this year. You smile. Good. Let them remind someone to handle beauty with care. As you turn back toward the palace, a wind rises, scattering petals across the path like pieces of paper. Each one a rumour, a memory, a promise kept. You don't look back. You never do, because revenge, at its most refined, doesn't watch for applause. It simply fades into legend, gentle, perfumed, and terrifyingly polite. You walk through the palace alone now, not in sorrow, not in exile, simply in peace. The halls that once hummed with gossip have fallen quiet, save for the occasional creak of wood, the faint brush of wind through curtains. Time has begun its slow erasure, smoothing everything into marble calm. This is the silence that follows queens. The courtiers are long gone. The council chambers are empty except for dust, and the portraits along the corridor, a gallery of faces staring from centuries past, no longer judge you. You stop in front of one and tilt your head. The painter caught your likeness well, poised, watchful, mouth almost smiling. Almost, you murmur. Because even in art, they never quite dared to let you look too alive. You move on. The marble floor is cold underfoot, but you don't mind. It reminds you that you're still here, that the stories they tell have not completely turned you into stone. In the great hall, the statues stand as they always have, kings on horses, generals with swords, saints with open hands. And there, tucked to the side, barely taller than a child, stands your likeness. No crown, no weapon, just you in a plain gown, looking up instead of down. You've seen it 1,000 times, but today it feels different. Because now you understand what the sculptor did. He didn't make you small out of disrespect. He made you small so people would have to lean in close to see you. So they would have to bow. The irony pleases you. You walk around the base of the statue. Someone has left flowers there. White lilies, a few wilted violets. You touch one gently, its petals cool as silk. The smell takes you back to your youth, the gardens, the letters, the sound of waves on that first foreign shore. It all feels impossibly far away now, like a story you once heard about someone else. Historians still argue whether your later years were happy. Some say you withdrew into faith, others say you became a silent power behind your son's reign. But the truth is simpler, quieter. You lived, you breathed, you grew older, that was all. And somehow it was enough. You glance toward the ceiling where sunlight filters through stained glass, casting a scatter of color across the stone. A deep blue pool shimmers at your feet, framed by gold and green. An accidental halo. You step into it and stand there, surrounded by light that has traveled across centuries to find you. You can feel the faint warmth of it on your skin. One quirky fact: in some old churches, the light from the stained glass was believed to purify those it touched, a kind of silent blessing through color. You wonder, smiling, if the same could be true for marble. Maybe that's why statues never frown. You turn back toward the door, and that's when you notice them. The visitors. A group of travelers, modern in dress, hushed and reverent, moving through the hall with cameras and notebooks. They stop in front of your statue. The guide begins to speak, her voice echoing softly against the stone. She was married by proxy, the guide says. She lived most of her life in this palace, but rarely saw her husband. Some say she ruled through kindness, others through silence. Historians still debate which was her greater weapon. The group nods. Someone whispers. She looks calm. Calm, the same word that followed you all your life. As if calm and power could not coexist. You want to laugh. You want to tell them how calm is a mask forged in fire, how peace is the final trick of endurance. But marble lips do not move. Still you imagine whispering into the air. Don't confuse stillness with surrender. The smallest child in the group tilts her head, steps forward, and looks up at your statue with wide eyes. She looks like she knows a secret, the girl says. Her mother smiles. Maybe she does. And in that moment, across centuries, across silence, you feel seen. The visitors move on, their footsteps fading down the hall. The guide's voice softens, replaced by the echo of the bells outside. The sound rolls through the corridors like the tide. You close your eyes and listen. The same bells that tolled for your wedding, your coronation, your exile, your death. They still ring, reshaping their tone with every generation. The city outside has changed, the language shifted, the skyline grown taller. But the bells remain, and so do you. Historians still argue whether your influence truly shaped the modern age or if you were merely its symbol. They debate the laws you inspired, the letters you wrote, the quiet reforms whispered into existence under your son's reign. Some call you cunning, others saintly. None quite agree. But maybe the truth was never meant to be unanimous, because truth, like memory, needs friction to stay alive. The marble around you gleams as the last rays of sunlight slip through the glass. The hall darkens. Somewhere outside, a raven cries once, low, clear, unhurried. You smile again, not in triumph, not in grief, just the kind of smile that belongs to someone who has finally seen the pattern from above and found it beautiful. Let them wonder, you whisper into the still air. That was always the point. You turn away from the statue and walk down the hall. Your reflection passes through the colours of the windows, blue, red, gold, until it disappears into the final patch of evening light. The bells ring once more, softer this time, fading into quiet. And the hall, filled with marble faces and echoes of laughter, keeps its silence, warm, watchful, eternal. It begins, as endings often do, in stillness. The city outside the palace sleeps beneath a fog that glows faintly in the lamplight. Somewhere in the distance, a carriage rattles down cobblestones, but even that sound fades quickly, absorbed by the hush that only deep night knows. Inside, the air tastes of dust, beeswax, and thyme. The tour guides have gone home. The velvet ropes hang slack. The marble floors gleam faintly under the dim watch of the moon. And Hughes, or rather she, the queen who never met her husband, still sits where the world last left her, halfway between legend and oblivion. Her statue glimmers faintly, the stone now softened by centuries of fingertips that have brushed her hand for luck, her cheek for courage. The letters she once wrote, the rooms she once ruled, the people she once defied, all of it folded neatly into history's ledger, filed under mystery. But memory, unlike marble, breathes. If you stand long enough in the hall, you can almost hear it. The faint, unhurried rhythm of her voice, not ghostly, but calm, steady, human. "I never sought power," she says. "I only refused to be erased." Her voice weaves through the silence like the thread of a distant lullaby. "They thought obedience was my cage, but it was my disguise. They thought my patience was weakness, but it was the art of waiting until they fell asleep." You close your eyes, and the centuries seem to fold inward. You are no longer looking at her. You are with her. In the candlelight, in the perfume of parchment and ash, in the long corridors that have learned to echo without echoing back. Her story, all of it, finally feels whole. The girl shipped across the sea, the bride who met a stranger, the wife who became a rumor, the queen who learned the languages of power and silence, the widow who rewrote her own ending in ink and patience, and now the legend who refuses to stay silent even in stone. Historians will still argue, of course. They always will. Whether she was saint or strategist, victim or victor, quiet manipulator or misunderstood martyr. But you know what they don't. She was simply alive. She loved. She learned. She waited. She forgave. And when the world finally looked away, she smiled, because she had already written the last line herself. "Let them build monuments," she once wrote. "I built memory, and memory lasts longer than marble." The air grows warmer, softer. The faint hum of the night settles into rhythm with your breathing. You picture her garden again, the roses that bloomed in frost, the fountain murmuring beneath the pale moon, the torn letters dissolving into water. You imagine that somewhere, even now, new roses grow from that same soil. Perhaps someone, a scholar, a child, a dreamer, will walk by and pluck one, not knowing whose grief fed its roots. Perhaps they'll smell it and feel, for reasons they can't name, a strange peace. Because grief, when tended carefully enough, becomes wisdom. And her life, all its loneliness, all its laughter, all its love that came too late, became that kind of wisdom. The quiet kind that doesn't need applause. The kind that waits in books, in ink, in dreams. You take one last look at her marble face. There's no sadness there, no grandeur, only calm. the calm of someone who has already forgiven the world for misunderstanding her, and who loves it anyway. Outside, the first birds begin to stir. The fog thins, the city breathes again, and so does she. Her legend doesn't fade. It exhales, expanding gently, through the dawn like perfume, like prayer, like the soft rustle of silk in an empty corridor. Now, dim the lights, let the hum of the night settle into your bones. She is gone, yes, but not entirely, because the world still remembers her voice when the bells ring at midnight, when a queen somewhere signs her name, when a woman somewhere keeps her silence a little longer than she should. That is her immortality, not marble, not myth, just the quiet, endless courage of being. Sleep now. Let the echoes fade. Let her story drift into the soft dark that keeps all stories safe. She is still here, and so are you. So, as the night settles fully around you, let your breathing slow. The noise of the world, the arguments of historians, the chatter of courtiers, even the echo of the bells, all of it drifts away now, softer with every breath you take. You've walked beside her through centuries of candlelight and marble, through letters and silences, through love that never arrived on time. You've seen her learn, adapt, forgive. And now you understand something she always knew. History isn't a story about power, it's a story about endurance. There's comfort in that, isn't there? Knowing that every quiet act, every word left unsaid, every choice made in patience, it all leaves a trace, however small. Outside your window, the night deepens. The hum of a fan or a distant streetlight fills the air, a modern echo of the same hush that wrapped palaces long ago. You can almost imagine her there, sitting beside you, smiling faintly at how peaceful the present sounds. The past doesn't ask to be forgiven. It just asks to be remembered gently. So let go now of the stories, the questions, the arguments. Let them float like the ash of her old letters, dissolving into quiet. Let your mind grow soft and weightless. In this last moment, the world is kind. The night holds you as it once held her. Steady, silent, endless. You've made it to the end. Sleep well, dream deeply, and carry her calm with you into morning. Sweet dreams.